Hello, and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 123rd episode of the Nauticast titled Winter Falls, an analysis of a Clash of Kings BRAN 6, in which Theon Greyjoy takes Winterfell? Wow, he must have had hundreds, thousands of dudes, right? Wait, he only had 40? No, that's pretty impressive. Or it's dumb. It's Theon Greyjoy. It's both. It's both very impressive and very, very dumb.
Somehow both at the same time. That's the Theon Greyjoy conundrum for you. And we're very happy to welcome on to the Nauticast a new guest for this episode. We've been looking forward to having him on. Please welcome Stanford Frasier to the Nauticast. Thanks for coming on with us, buddy.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to go and speak to the not of listeners. Right?
The not
and not of watchers.
As they're known.
Or
the not of watchers.
Yeah, and early spoiler warning, but I'm excited to take a deep dive into the future God Emperor of Dune. I mean, God Emperor of Westeros. So let's do it.
Can't wait. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. We were looking forward to have you on for a long time now, and it's going to be you chose a very plot heavy, very consequential chapter to jump on the Nauticast on. So we appreciate you taking the brave step forward and joining us for this episode, because this episode is crazy. This chapter is crazy too, isn't it? So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our Not a Small Council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, troubleshooters of systems and designer of circuit boards, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Captain of the War Galley Night Wolf, the ship that stalks the seven seas, and wielder of the Valyrian Steel's Trident Summoner, the blade that brings the deep ones, Sir Keith J, Master of Whispers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman, and Mistress of Whispers, Lord Micah, the Quilled Lion, Ward of the West, Herald of the Golden Tooth, Master of the Bane Fort, and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zene of Lyria, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dayne, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, War of the Beast and Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Steve the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorcidelica, Prince Matthew of House Targaryen, Proud Soy Boy of Summerhall, Defender of the Fifth Book, and Swing Dancer with Dragons, the artist formerly known as Sir K.W. Dent, Elsie the Blackwood Guard, and Batman of the Seven Kingdoms, who is now being known as Low Energy Dent. Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentle Dems, Lord Quinn, Esquire, Master of Absolutely Positively not serving as a spy for several unnamed high lords and ladies in order to further the secret Blackfire-style conspiracy to overthrow the oppressive small council. Haldover, the Waiter for Tiwa, A.A. Ron, Damper, Prophet of the Forsaken, and High Priest of Euron Crowseye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneris of House Golgarian, the First of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mrs. Fart, the Overwork, Queen of Pencils, the Eraser in the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee, the Great Game of Thrones, Portress of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Blender Paints, and Maker of Drawings. Lord Adam T, Lady Alexander of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logus, Bloody Scorpio of the Redfield, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle. Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse, Face, Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, Lady Ashley, the Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, Marshall, Harrison, Absent, Shipwrecked, Still in the Jade Sea, Grave, Rob Stark, the Cadaver King and Horror of Harrenhal, Olaf, proponent of establishing a feudal, pseudo-democratic system of great councils wherein every count votes, Sir Tim, the Knight who is guided by voices, Lord Nick, Thucydides, Lord of Plagues, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dayton, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, Lord Jean the Splendid, Master of Coin, Warden of Tampa Bay, Lady Anna, the Lovely Castellan, Pat Ironwood, the Blood Royal and Guardian of the Boneway, Lord Charles Tyrell of Highgarden, Lord Paramount of the Manor, Defender of the Marches, High Marshal of the Reach, Lord of the South, and the Heir of House Tyrell, Luke, Lord of Lone Leaf and the Pillar of Autumn, Squid Pro Quo, and Master of Zorse. Thank you to all of our small counselors very much.
Thank you to our counselors as always.
And our spoiler warning, as we say in all episodes, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Wins Winner sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, a TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Warden of the Waves, who asks, I don't want to add to the incredibly hard work on The Forsaken, but one thing I'd be interested in hearing in the final part is how the other characters will react to Euron Greyjoy and how they find out about his looming threat. Will Bloodraven tell Bran that Euron means to take control of the others? Will Melisandre begin to see Euron looking back at her from the flames? Will she tell Jon and others of his ambitions? Will Makuro and Marwyn counsel Dany on the need to stop Euron? And I don't want to give away too much from our continuing 5-part series on the Forsaken for our patrons. And specifically in regards to Bloodraven and Bran, I'm definitely going to have plenty to say when we get to that final part. But I'm curious as to what you folks think about the Red Priest's angle in Travis's question there. Because both Makuro and Melisandre have seen visions that could be said to be about Euron in A Dance with Dragons. And so do you think that they're going to involve their respective messiah figures in this kind of the plot? Is Melisandre going to tell Jon about Euron? Is Makuro going to tell Dany about Euron? What do you think about that?
I think yes, on some level, that Makuro has seen the vision of Euron in the flames and seeing the tentacles reaching out and apparently controlling Victarion. And Victarion's like, well, I'm making me dance. I don't dance. I mean, that's Victarion's response to that. So Makuro's just like, God, this guy's so fucking dumb. Like,
it's a metaphor.
The dragon can't get this guy soon enough. You know, I mean, it's just like it's hilarious. But I think that Makuro will find a more willing and amenable audience in the form of Daenerys, because Daenerys is intelligent, smart, and also able to deal with things that are complex, such as a metaphor, which is not super complex, is the way that Makuro is working out with Victarion. So I think we will see that from Dany and in terms of what Euron is doing. But my question is whether it's actually going to be a Dany versus Euron showdown. Now, I think if Euron gets a dragon at some level, I think there will be. But if he doesn't, is this going to be something that's going to be taken care of by your favorite Tyrell brothers?
That's true. I do love Willis and Garland, and that's something that again we'll get to in the end part of our Forsaken episode. But I'm wondering, because obviously Dany and Euron are far apart geographically, and there's plenty both of those characters have to do. But I'm curious, Stanford, do you think Dany and Euron might have a romantic connection, or like a potential, like an attempt at a romantic connection? Because I'm thinking about the kind of guys Dany likes. I'm thinking about Drogo. I'm thinking about Daario. It's like they're not that far off from Euron. Do you think something might happen there?
I've actually never considered if that was going to happen. When I saw the question, I thought, well, I know for a fact Melisandre's going to see Euron but misinterpret it.
Exactly.
So that is destined.
That must be something in a completely different direction. Melisandre am very correct. Yeah,
that's destined to happen. I kind of thought that Euron was probably going to be more Bran's antagonist, and maybe he doesn't have that many interactions with him.
That makes sense to me. I mean, again, this is something we'll get into more detail about, but there's almost kind of like a Star Wars angle, I think, to Bran, Bloodraven, and Euron, and that when I left you, I was but this learner, and now I'm the master. That's kind of Euron's kind of angle, and he's the dark, twisted version of who Bran could be. So yeah, no, I agree with that. I feel like George is teasing in that direction with Dany, because you do have like Daario, his sellswords are named the Storm Crows, and Euron is the Crow's Eye, and he says he's the Storm. So there's some links there. I've always felt that probably Dany's going to refuse Euron if that does come up, because I don't think she's really got room in her plot to literally link up with him. But yeah, I think I agree with you, Stanford, that I think he's going to be on the periphery of a bunch of different plots, but the character I think who will the POV at least, who will most centrally have to take him down is Bran. Now, I think Sam is going to be our POV on a lot of stuff Euron does, because Sam is the POV in the area. But I don't think Sam himself is going to be the one who takes down Euron. I think he's just going to be around while that stuff happens.
Now, here's something to consider. I think that Bran makes the perfect amount of sense to be the point of view where you would have some sort of confrontation between Euron and Bran, perhaps not in person, perhaps something on the astral plane, which is something we've talked about in the past. But Bran works as like the perfect opposite to Euron Greyjoy, because he's the only person that was chosen to be Bloodraven's apprentice when Euron was rejected. So for once in the entire existence of Euron Greyjoy, he finally has someone that was actually better at him than something. Because Euron, by and large, is better than all of his brothers at everything, as he tries to say over and over again to Aaron Damphair and to Victarion, which is, I guess, obviously true. But whoops,
Sure.
sorry, Vic. I mean, I like you, man. I mean, people, but obviously Euron is much smarter than Victarion, and obviously has a better grasp of how to manipulate people using these kind of interesting religious themes than Aaron Damphair is, and of course the old way too, and manipulating the way to do that. But Bran represents something that is much different in that he has been chosen by Bloodraven, and he passed Bloodraven's initial test in the third chapter in a Game of Thrones, or third Bran chapter in a Game of Thrones, in which he was able to fly instead of die. So Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to have Bran and Euron be the ultimate antagonists to one another, and of course, Bran to triumph over Euron, which would be awesome. Can't wait for that.
Yeah, you make a great point. Something I've said about Euron before is that he really doesn't have a chip on his shoulder compared to someone like Joffrey or Ramsay, who are clearly motivated by like, no, Dad didn't love me, and no one does it right, no one respects me. Euron doesn't seem to care very much. But I think you're totally right that the one kind of way in that regard would be Bran kind of succeeding where he has failed and forcing him to deal with that. You know, Bran being a kind of much more earnest little fantasy protagonist guy. So I think that totally makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Lord Travis, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions, we answer here on the Notacast podcast. You're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over on patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF, where you can get show notes, bonus posts, and bonus episodes like our analysis of the Chapter 12 of Fever Dream, the wonderful vampire novel by George R. R. Martin, which is out for all Poor Fellow and above patrons over at patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF.
And just to let you folks know, we'll be taking next week off because it is a family vacation for me. So there will be no live cast next week. Well, we're all sad, but not to fear. For those of you who have never heard it, we'll be releasing the Second Coming Part 1, the first of our 5-part analysis on The Winds of Winter, The Forsaken, as a Patreon sample for everyone, for the people. So if you like what you hear, please consider joining our Patreon. And if we talked about this last week, but to reemphasize, if we achieve our next patron goal of either 1,250 patrons, again, a very specific number, or $7,500 a month, we will start an intensive series on the Hedge Knight for all of our patrons. And mea culpa, Emmett, last week I forgot to mention probably the most impressive thing that will happen if we reach that stretch goal. And that is that Emmett will record and release the first chapter from his forthcoming novel, Too Deep. So again, if you like what you hear, check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with Brandon Stark, Jojen Reed had prophesied that the sea was coming to Winterfell. Weird, huh? Let's find out what that ambiguous prophecy meant in this synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Bran 6. The sound was the faintest of clinks, a scraping of steel over stone. He lifted his head from his paws, listened, sniffing at the night. The rain has fallen, and Summer, Bran, could smell 100 smells ripening the ground. There were berry smells, grass smells. Summer, Bran, could smell Shaggy Dog, Rickon, and squirrels too. He could hear the squirrels clamoring around the trees and the strange noises that sounded like. And then Summer, Bran, hears that sound again. He rises to his haunches and howls into the night, but the piles of quote-unquote man rock don't stir. The night was still, and Summer, Bran, knew that men were sticking nearby fires tonight to keep warm. Shaggy Dog comes up as quiet as Ghost had been back in the day, his fur bristling. He had heard the sounds as well and known they meant danger. This time, the clink and scrape were followed by a slithering and the soft, swift patter of skin feet on stone. The wind brought the faintest whiff of a man's smell he did not know. Stranger, danger, death. Shaggy, Rickon, and Summer, Bran race toward the sound, and Winterfell rises up before them. Summer bares his teeth towards the castle, but the stone was dead and uncaring. He sees the gates and throws himself at it, but the gate holds. He could only force his muscles between the bars, but he and Shaggy both know that the gate wouldn't budge, and they couldn't dig through the gate either. There was more rock underneath. Still, Summer throws himself up against the gate, but it only moves slightly. Summer knows somehow that the gate is locked. They cannot get out, and the way is shut. There is, the whisper came, and it seemed as if he could see the shadow of a great tree covered in needles slanting up out of the black earth to 10 times the height of a man. Yet when he looked about, it was not there. The other side of God's Wood, the sentinel. Hurry, hurry. Through the gloom of night came a muffled shout, cut short. Swiftly, swiftly he whirled and bounded back into the trees, wet leaves rustling beneath his paws, branches whipping at him as he rushed past. He could hear his brother following close. They plunged under the heart tree and around the cold pool, through blackberry bushes, under a tangle of oaks and ash and hawthorn scrub to the far side of the wood. And there it was, the shadow he'd glimpsed without seeing, the slanting tree pointing at the rooftops. Sentinel, came the thought. Summer, Bran, remembers how to climb and thinks about the needles on the tree that would scratch at his face, the sap that would stick to his paws, hands, now how the branches were close together and created a natural ladder. Summer growls and pisses on the tree to mark the spot to climb up. He tries then to grab a branch, but it cracks and breaks off while Shaggy sits and howls with mourning. Summer, Bran, realizes that there is no way up the tree. They weren't squirrels. They were wolves and not made for this climbing shit. But then the dogs start to bark into a great clamor, trying desperately to warn everyone of foes and fear coming. They're really good dogs, these dogs of Winterfell. Rage fills Summer, and he springs forward and up, churning wet leaves and pine needles into the air. He feels like a hunter. Summer smells fear and is driven forward by it. Upward he bounded up, 2 bounds, 3, hardly slowing until he was among the lower limbs. Branches tangled his feet and whipped at his eyes. Gray-green needles scattered as he shouldered through them, snapping. He had to slow. Something snagged at his foot, and he wrenched it free, snarling. The trunk narrowed under him, the slope steeper, almost straight up and wet. The bark tore like skin when he tried to claw at it. He was a third of the way up, halfway more. The roof was almost within reach. And then he put down a foot and felt it slip off the curve of wet wood. And suddenly he was sliding, stumbling. He yowled in fear and fury, falling, and twisted around while the ground rushed up to break him. And then Bran was back at bed in his lonely tower room, tangled in his blankets and his breath coming hard. "Summer!" he cried aloud. "Summer!" His shoulders seemed to ache as if he had fallen on it, but he knew it was only the ghost of what the wolf was feeling. Jojen told it true. I am a beastling. Bran hears dogs barking and knows now that the sea has come and is flowing over the walls just as Jojen foretold. Bran tries shouting for help, but no one comes, and no one would come. Roger Cassell had taken every spare man and boy for battle against Dagmar Cleftjaw, who was attacking Torrhen Square. So Winterfell only had a token garrison. Bran pulls himself up on his bed, swinging from his bed to his window. After opening the window, Bran hollers for Hodor in the stables. Then he yells for Osha, Mira, Jojen. But then the door crashes open, and the man who comes in isn't someone that Bran knows. Bran demands to know who he is and what he wants. He then orders him to get the fuck out of his room. Theon Greyjoy followed him into the bedchamber. "We're not here to harm you, Bran." "Theon?" Bran felt dizzy with relief. Did Robb send you? Is he here now?" "Robb's far away. He can't help you now." "Help me?" Bran was confused. Don't scare me, Theon. I'm Prince Theon now. We're both princes, Bran. Ha! Who would have dreamed it? But I've taken your castle, my prince. Bran's like, no, you didn't. And no, you didn't, Theon. The only thing you've ever taken is shit from everyone who's ever known you. Okay, he doesn't exactly say that, but point remains. Theon orders his man and some Ironborn bro with the name of Werlig, bet that guy had a fun elementary school experience, to get out of the room. And then Theon seats himself on the bed and brags about how he took the castle with 4 bros who climbed the moat, who then opened the gate for the rest of the Ironborn. Are you impressed about how fucking awesome I am, 8-year-old boy? You should be. Bran did not understand. But your father's ward. And now you and your brothers are my wards. As soon as the fighting's done, my men will be bringing the rest of your people together in the Great Hall. You and I are going to speak to them. You'll tell them how you've yielded Winterfell to me, and command them to serve and obey their new lord as they did the old. I won't, Bran said. We'll fight you and throw you out. I never yielded, and you can't make me say that I did. Theon decides that the time for debate with this 8-year-old is now over. He won't be taking any shit from said 8-year-old. Bran better do what Theon says. Theon then leaves, probably thinking about how he totally owned this 8-year-old lib, wondering whether Bran will need ointment for the burn he just inflicted on him. Back in Bran's chambers, though, Bran feels helpless while he waits. He hears shouting and maybe a clash of swords. Is that better, George? But he doesn't have Summer's ears or nose. He's broken when he's awake, alive in Summer when he sleeps. Bran expects Hodor will come to get him, but instead it's Maester Luwin who turns up. The good Maester asks him if he knows what happened, and Bran does. Luwin reports that the Ironborn swam the moat and came up over the walls. They killed Eobailey on the turret above the gate. Hayhead is also wounded. Luwin was able to send off 2 ravens away from Winterfell, but only the one intended for Wyman fucking Mannerly made it off. The other, unfortunately, was shot down. The Maesters stare at the rushes. Sir Roderick took too many of our men. But I'm as much to blame as he is. I never saw this danger. I never. Jojen saw it, Bran thought. You better help me dress. Luwin, buddy, love you, man. But this is exactly what Jojen warned you about, if I'm not mistaken. If I remember, like, the past 3 chapters that have had Jojen reading it. Anyways, he did it in albeit cryptic Jojen way, so I give you a little bit of credit there. Luwin declares that Bran must look princely and like Robb's heir, and together they get Bran into princely garments. Bran says that Theon wants him to yield the castle, and Luwin says there's no shame in that. A lord must protect his small folk. Yeah. But Luwin wrings his hands over Theon, thinking that Ned tried with Theon, but it was too little, too late. A squat, annoyed Ironborn brogue then comes to grab Bran, and he carries Bran to the High Hall. As they move through the castle, they find a cranky Rickon who demands to see his mom. Yeah, this really sucks bad. Lewin says that Catelyn is far away, but Lewin is here. So is Bran. Lewin takes Rickon by the hand and they keep on. Farther on, they find Mira and Jojen being forced from their room by an Ironborn guy with a long spear. And then they find those damned Walters Frey who proceed to taunt Bran about his brother losing his kingdom. And now he's just a hostage.
So are you, Jojen said. And me. And all of us.
No one was talking to you, Frog Eater. The Ironborn lead them out of the courtyard with a torch, but the rain snuffs it out. Bran hears direwolves howling, and he hopes that Summer isn't hurt. In the Great Hall of Winterfell, Bran finds Theon sitting in the high seat of the Starks, and I'm really unhappy at this story development. Theon is all decked out in Ironborn garb with fucking squids and shit, and Rickon says that Theon is sitting in Robb's chair. Goddamn right it's Robb's chair. But Bran tells Rickon to be quiet. A few torches had been lit, and a fire kindled in the great hearth, but most of the hall remained in darkness. There was no place to sit with the benches stacked against the walls, so the castle folk stood in small groups, not daring to speak. He saw old Nan, her toothless mouth opening and closing. Hayhead was carried in between two of the other guards, a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his bare chest. Poxy Tim wept inconsolably, and Beth Cassell cried with fear. Theon regards the Reeds and Freys and thinks it's quite unfortunate they were here when he arrived for them, but it's quite fortunate for him. More people then show up to the Great Hall. Gage and Osha arrive. Mikken comes in cursing. Farland was limping and trying to support Paula, whose dress had been ripped in half. She walks in agony, ugh. Septon Shale tries to help, but one of the Iron Men knocks him to the ground. I don't know, guys. I'm starting to think that Theon might be a bad guy. It's a crazy talk. I know. The last man marched through the doors was the prisoner Reek, whose stench preceded him, ripe and pungent. Bran felt his stomach twist at the smell of him. "We found this one locked in a tower cell," announced his escort, a beardless youth with ginger-colored hair and sodden clothing, doubtless one of those who'd swum the moat. "He says what they call him Reek." "Can't think why," Theon says, smiling. "Do you always smell so bad, or did you just finish fucking a pig?" "Haven't fucked no one since they took me, my lord. Heeks my true name. I was in service to the bastard of Bolton till the Starks gave him an arrow in the back for a wedding gift." Theon found that amusing. "Who'd he marry?" "The widow of Hornwood, my lord." "That crone? Was he blind? She has teats like empty wineskins, dry and fucking withered." "It wasn't her teats he wet her for, my lord." The doors are then shut, and Bran considers that there are only 20 Ironborn in the hall. There were probably more outside, but the party couldn't have been larger than 30 in total, Bran judges. Theon starts bellowing about how everyone knows him, and Mikken says, "Yeah, we know you're a gigantic piece of horseshit." He then gets the butt of the spear for that remark. Bran tells Mikken to be quiet, but Bran can't summon his lord's voice. Theon tells Mikken to listen to Bran. A good lord protects his people, Bran reminded himself. "I have yielded Winterfell to Theon." "Louder, Bran, and call me Prince." Bran raised his voice. "I have yielded Winterfell to Prince Theon. All of you should do as he commands you." "Damned if I will," bellowed Becken. Theon ignored the outburst. "My father has donned the ancient crown of Sultan Rock and declared himself king of the Iron Islands. He claims the north as well by right of conquest. You are all his subjects." "Bugger that!" Mikken whipped the blood from his mouth. "I serve the Starks, not some treasonous squaw." The butt of a spear smashed him face first into the stone. Theon mocks Mikken before continuing on to say that he's going to be generous and awesome to the small folk, just like Ned. Meanwhile, Mikken spits blood while Bran prays that he doesn't speak. Mikken, though, doesn't listen, and he correctly accuses the Ironborn of being a sorry lot. The bald man drove the point of his spear into the back of Mikken's neck. Steel slid through flesh and came out of his throat in a welter of blood. A woman screamed, and Mira wrapped her arms around Rickon. "It's blood he drowned on," Bran thought numbly. "His own blood." Theon, who will be as generous a lord as Ned was, wonders if anyone has anything else to say, and Hodor starts hodoring. This leads to Theon, as generous a lord as Ned was, to order his men to shut Hodor up. So the Ironborn beat Hodor up with the butts of their spears as Hodor falls to the floor, trying to shield himself with his hands. "I will be as good a lord to you as Eddard Stark was." Theon raised his voice to be heard above the smack of wood on flesh. "Betray me, though, and you'll wish you hadn't. And don't think the men you see here are the whole of my power. Torrhen Square and Deepwood Motte will soon be ours as well. And my uncle is sailing up the salt-spirited seas boat Kaelin. If Robb Stark can stave off the Lannisters, he may reign as king of the Trident hereafter. but House Greyjoy holds the north for now. Reek says the North will fight the Ironborn, the Manderleys, Umbers, and Karstarks will fight to eject Theon from Winterfell. So how about Theon frees Reek, right? Huh? He'll so totally serve Theon faithfully, he says, while probably fantasizing about the skinning knife that he's going to apply to Theon Greyjoy. Theon thinks this clever, but he's not about to take some guy who smells bad into his service. He has standards? No, he doesn't. Reek says he'll bathe, and Theon smiles and orders him to bend the knee. One of the Iron Men handed Reek a sword, and he laid it at Theon's feet and swore obedience to House Greyjoy and King Balon. Bran could not look. The Grey Dream was coming true. But Lord Greyjoy, Osha stepped past Micken's body. I was brought here captive too. You were there the day I was taken. I thought you were a friend, Bran thought, hurt. Theon, as generous and as good a lord as Ned Stark ever was, says he doesn't need sluts in his service. Osha responds that she was only in the kitchens because Robb put her there. She was a fighter before all that. She wants a spear in her hand yet again. The bald man who murdered Micken grabs his stick and says he has a spear for Osha, and Osha knees his crotch, steals the stick, and tells him, no thanks. Everyone laughs, and Theon welcomes Osha into his service so long as she bends the knee. When no one else rushed forward to pledge service, they were dismissed with a warning to do their work and make no trouble. Hodor was given the task of bearing Bran back to his bed. His face was all ugly from the beating, his nose swollen and one eye closed. Hodor, he sobbed between cracked lips as he lifted Bran in his huge, strong arms and bloody hands and carried him back out into the rain. And that is the miserable end of the gut-wrenching chapter that is A Clash of Kings, Bran 6. Everything about this feels totally fucking unfair, and it hurts to reach the chapter that signals the death knell of the Stark cause. The cause that, despite me liking Stannis, the one that I believe is the only justified cause of the War of the Five Kings. What did you gentlemen think of this chapter?
So we've been loving the beautiful slow burn of these Bran chapters in the Clash of Kings, as his coming of age dovetails with the rising magical and political tides in Westeros. But now the slow burn is over, for the plot has suddenly arrived. And as I've said before about the Northern storyline in A Clash of Kings, there are a couple of creaky elements to that plot. Still, this is a gripping, suspenseful chapter. And on reread, it becomes clear that George is not bulldozing the intricate groundwork he laid in those earlier Bran chapters. Instead, the earlier themes and conflicts are, in this chapter, put to the test in the sudden pressure cooker of Theon Greyjoy, of all people, taking Winterfell. But I want to hear what our guest thought. What stood out to you this time through, Stanford?
You know, I really love this chapter, even though it's a pretty sad chapter. I felt like it was more sad reading it, even though I know what happens eventually. I think some moments that really stuck out to me was when Bran woke up from his wolf dream. He was actually very scared. He felt alone. This random person comes into his room, but then he sees Theon. Oh my goodness, thank you. Theon's here. And there's like a moment where he feels relieved. And I'm reading it. I have the narrator voice. He shouldn't have felt relieved. And then Theon explains to him what happens. And you can just see how broken this makes Bran feel, how crushed he is in this moment. And I think it was a really good way of George demonstrating Theon's betrayal through the eyes of a boy. I think another thing that actually stood out was Jojen's green side abilities being confirmed as something that was real. But that his prophecy or his prediction came about in a more poetic than literal way, which is going to be good for Bran's future, knowing what Jojen saw. But I think it's also something to keep in mind for the reader as we go through other prophecies and magical visions throughout this story. It's almost a short story of the monkey's paw. You know, the dreams are going to come true, those wishes are going to come true, but maybe not in the exact way that you thought it would.
Right. I think it's a great dynamic that George explores, and he does that several times with prophecy, and he's specifically talked about utilizing prophecy in an ambiguous way and having people meditate on it and come to the wrong conclusions, as Melis Hunter does for practically fucking everything. And in that kind of light, I was thinking about this idea of prophecy and magic and how it exists in A Song of Ice and Fire. And as much as like a lot of the latter part of this chapter is where the plot meat is and what people remember, I find the early parts especially intriguing. I mean, we've had flashes of Bran living through Summer's eyes, but the chapter open was the longest scene yet we've had of warwicking, which is the process of man and wolf kind of meeting in the middle and man kind of living in the mind of a wolf for a little while. It's something we're going to revisit in the final Bran and Clash of Kings chapter, with Bran warging Summer in an even longer sequence. But I want to highlight it here because I'm fairly confident, wink wink, George's writing of Bran's direwolf scenes will be turned to 11 come the Winds Winter and Jon Snow's chapters. In Bran's Clash and his also future Storm and Dance chapters, George has created the architecture for how to depict the perspective of direwolves. But come The Winds Winter, I imagine we're going to be seeing entire chapters from the perspective of Ghost. And what we'll be getting is some sort of melding of Jon and Ghost consciousness together, much as we see Bran and Summer's mind attempt to find understanding of the danger coming over the walls of Winterfell. The language, though, is scattershot, communicated mostly through emotion and instinct. But as Bran and Jon's warging abilities grow, the synthesis of man and wolf will also deepen. The challenge for Jon and Bran is the one that is whether the challenge for Bran and Jon, the Winds Winter, will be to achieve this magical synthesis and avoid the way that Varamir's Sixskins became. Every day, his memory fades and the beast becomes a little less a warg, a little more a wolf, until nothing of the man is left, and only the beast remains.
I think you both make really good points about the issue of control with magic and about how much this is really under Bran's control and how much he needs to be aware of that this will, like a monkey's paw, just turn on him. And he's not fully aware of things, even though these are strictly speaking his powers. And he has to be a little more self-conscious, almost a little more genre savvy about this, how that kind of thing works. When Stanford mentioned the monkey's paw, I thought about there's the one Simpsons episode where Homer gets a monkey's paw and he's like unusually smart with it. He says, you know what? I want a turkey sandwich. And I don't want these zombie turkeys. I don't want to turn into a turkey myself. I don't want any other weird surprises. Got it? Because in that moment, Homer knows how those stories kind of work. And Bran is still young. He's still taking the stories at face value. He's not really thinking critically about how these things line up with reality. And unfortunately, neither is Melisandre. You get a character like Mance Rayder and his wife Dalla who say, yeah, we have this magic power, but we don't want to use it because we know that like a monkey's paw, it's always going to be unexpected and always going to turn on us. So we really don't want to have to rely on this. Bran is going to have to develop his own distinct relationship to magic. But in the kind of the bigger picture of the story, as we said last week, George perfectly structures this chunk of A Clash of Kings, cutting right from Catelyn's nameless dread to a disaster that gives it form. The gods have given us victory after victory, so why am I so afraid? She thought. Why do I sense defeat? Well, here is the defeat that she sensed. The fall of the Stark castle, the center of Robb's fledgling kingdom and her family homestead. The fall of Winterfell and everything that comes from it turns Robb's victories into ash, commencing the hollowing out of his kingdom. It continues to have major ramifications well into a storm of swords and a feast for crows and a dance with dragons. Within A Clash of Kings, I think it's notable that this chapter comes at exactly the same point in the book as Ned's downfall in the throne room in Book 1. In both cases, we have 23 chapters to go in the book, roughly a third of the book. This is the second act break, with dividing each book into 3 acts, and as such, it's where everything ramps up. From here, as in Book 1, after the throne room scene, things get climactic. Not only in Winterfell, but in King's Landing, with the Battle of Blackwater, the Riverlands with the fall of Harrenhal to Roose Bolton, Beyond the Wall with Qhorin Halfhand and Jon's mission in the Frostfangs, and of course in Karth with Dany's trip through the House of the Undying. So this is a big moment, one of the hinges of the story. Yet it begins on the smallest, humblest note imaginable, a quiet sound barely perceptible in the night. George lets us know right away that we're not, strictly speaking, in Bran's head, we're in Summer's head, as he lifts that head from his paws. Paws. Okay, so we're in a wolf. And this is the most time we spend warging in the series so far. As such, even as George keeps our focus on learning what's happening in Winterfell, he is also educating us on how warging works, because all the info about what's happening in Winterfell is filtered to us through the warging process. So you could say our detective work as readers is doubled in this part of the chapter. Even as the tension rises, even as we realize something bad is happening, it's obscured by the wolf perspective. Sensory information is what overwhelms Bran inside Summer. The wolves have such powerful ears and noses compared to men, and Bran just soaks it all in. I think this is familiar to anyone who's ever owned a dog. When you're walking them and they're running around, sniffing around trees, you can tell they're just soaking in so much more information than you could even possibly conceive of. And that's what's happening to Bran here. Coming back on reread, I think you can tease an arc out of these specific sensory details that Summer picks up on. There's kind of a metaphor for the overall story here. You have blackberries broken on the ground. And that made me think about how when Bran was thinking he was going to leave Winterfell in Book 1, he had to say goodbye to everyone. He wanted to say specifically goodbye to someone who had given him a blackberry from the greenhouse in Winterfell. So it represents his childhood innocence. And now those blackberries are lying broken on the ground. His wistful dreams of the night he could have been in King's Landing are broken on the ground. Then you have some mud, you have worms, you have rotting leaves. That's like the sedimentary layer of death that's taking hold in a Westeros at war. Everything's being reduced to mud. Everything is a feast for worms. And you have a rat, as Summer describes it, crawling through all of that. And that, of course, is Theon, the rat who's going to betray the Starks and take over Winterfell in this chapter. Bran, in Summer, compares the sound he heard, that little clink of unfamiliar noise that started the chapter, he compares it to the sound of squirrels climbing trees. Because what he is hearing is men climbing the walls of, quote, Manrock. Bran previously compared Winterfell to a great stone tree, so this comparison makes sense. Those men are climbing just like he used to climb. Bran in Summer hears the noise again and howls to try and wake the castle up. A howl to wake the sleepers, is how George puts it. And that connects this scene to the Night's Watch, who vow to be the horn that wakes the sleepers. And just like how the Night's Watch is being abandoned and ignored by the powers that be down in King's Landing, no one takes heed of Summer's warning in time. And that comparison is further bolstered when Bran in Summer compares Shaggy Dog to Ghost, to Jon's wolf. It's as if these two storylines have briefly become one. The wolves hear as George puts it, the soft, swift patter of skin feet on stone. That's just beautiful alliteration on his part. And it reminds me of Lord of the Rings, the way George described it when he says that the wolf note means stranger, danger, death. Like that's how they phrase it in the Shire when the ring wraiths show up. That they're blowing their horns and they're shouting, "There's strangers, there's dangers, there's death." And there's the added resonance in A Song of Ice and Fire, of course, because we know that the stranger is quite literally the god of death.
Yes, it's very interesting that that wolf brand, right, or that the dire wolves, they can sense the danger, right? You hear the metal clashing, and on reread, you realize, oh yes, that's definitely the Iron. Like immediately, you realize that's the Ironborn coming to take Winterfell. But even the wolves, they don't necessarily know how to interpret the sound, but they know it's some type of danger, and they actually try to escape the Godswood, but they're locked in. I think it was 2 or 3 BRAN chapters ago. I think Sir Roderick locked them in after one of them rightfully attacked the Walder Freys. And you kind of compare that to a Game of Thrones where Summer comes and saves Bran and Catelyn from the Cat Sparrow. And it kind of is a returning theme throughout the books that when the Starks lock up their wolves, almost locking up maybe their northern side, their smarter instincts, bad things happen, right? You have Grey Wind being a bit locked up before the Red Wedding. You have Jon locking up Ghost before he gets mutinied in Dance with Dragons.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a terrific comparison. It's these animals who represent your instincts and your soul, and you got to lock them away to be like a rational person who doesn't believe in such things as wolves or dragons. But that magical side, that instinctive side, has some wisdom that's really important, and that Bran has to integrate them. And unfortunately, that's not the case here, and Winterfell suffers for it. And so we have to interpret everything through the wolf's understanding. He describes his cage as being made of snakes and bones, whereas we would use words like walls and gates. Because as a wolf, he perceives everything as part of nature, not as man-made objects. It further enhances the sense of Winterfell as being like a tree, like a living being unto itself. But it's not just Summer hanging out in Summer's brain. Bran is in there too, and suddenly we hear a boy's voice whispering, locked, chained. That's the human understanding. And that's also the human condition, being locked within ourselves, locked within our brains and our perspective, unable to break outside it. Bran, however, is doing something that people in the real world, generally speaking, can't do. He's breaking the metaphorical chains of which Jojen spoke. He is now a living presence inside his wolf, a scent without a smell, as Summer describes it, something beyond the physical world that his wolf knows so well. Bran's subconscious is not merely defining the world of man for his wolf. He begins to influence the wolf's actions, driving him to act more like a human. The wolf sees no way out of the cage. But the boy remembers. There's the sentinel tree he used to climb, like the squirrels the wolves hear. Summer hurries over to it as he hears shouts from outside the Godswood. The tension is ramping up, and we as readers desperately want Summer to succeed and warn somebody. Yet amidst the suspense, there is also humor, producing the singular tone of this chapter where you have horror and tension, but also this kind of underlying note of humor, because there is something very funny about picturing a wolf trying to climb a tree. That's ridiculous. That's silly. As Stanford was saying in our little pre-episode, there's something very cartoonish, very Looney Tunes about that. The boy remembers how it was to climb, remembers how much he loved it, but his warging powers can't bring those days back. As a wolf, Summer's first instinct is to pee on the tree and marking it. Shaggy Dog mournfully reminds Summer that, no, wolves don't climb. That's not our thing. That's for men and squirrels. Remember, Ned compared Bran to a squirrel back in book 1. Still, Summer tries. He retreats, and then he rushes forward as fast as he can, jumping up the trunk, running past branches, almost making it to the wall. And then he slips and falls. He falls like Bran before him. The combination of man and wolf has left Bran and Summer caught in between. A wolf's body trying to carry out the duties of man. This attempt to reconcile the two, which I think is really kind of the structure of Bran's whole story. Right here, it's just ended in pain.
Right. And I think it's part of the training arc for Bran and his warging abilities in order to kind of learn more how to actually become a warg and how to access this power that he has, this intrinsic power he has as a Stark, and especially with Summer specifically. And because this is a Bran chapter, and George does this so well throughout all of Bran's chapters in A Clash of Kings, we have a balance. So we have certain Bran chapters which tend to focus on the magical elements. We have certain Bran chapters which tend to focus on the political elements. Here, George does this thing where he switches the storytelling device a third of the way through the chapter to have us move from the warging and from the magical side to the political side. And so I figure, like we did for the Rite of King's Landing, that, and what we did also for Ned's downfall in a Game of Thrones, I figure it would be a good spot to track how densely George plotted the Stark political downfall in the North with precise timing and the small moments that then snowball into larger details. So, and what better way to track George's excellent setup and payoff than Ned Stark's downfall, as what I referenced before. So, of course, Ned gets betrayed in King's Landing, which causes his son to Rob to call the banners. He takes most of the fighting men south in hopes of scoring victories against the Lannisters and taking either Jaime or Tywin prisoner into exchange for Ned. They win against Jaime, taking him prisoner, but Ned is executed, leading to the Northern Lords to declare Rob king in the North. Now that Rob is king, he has to fight for the North and the Riverlands' independence from the Iron Throne, so he can't go back north yet. But he also needs allies like the Ironborn. So he sends Theon to the Iron Islands in hopes of scoring an alliance with Balon Greyjoy with predictable results. Catelyn told you, Rob, you should have known better. Meanwhile, in the north, we've got trouble in the Hornwood lands with the Manderleys and Boltons getting into a war footing over Lady Danella Hornwood and her hand in marriage. Danella comes to the Harvest Feast along with a bunch of other northern lords, but Lewin and Roderick can't figure out who she should marry, so they punt the issue to Robb Stark, who, again, is still fighting in the fucking Riverlands, and then they send her away with only the smallest of escorts. Lady Hornwood then gets ambushed on the road back to Castle Hornwood by Ramsay Snow, who forcibly marries her, and this leads to open war in the woods between the Manderleys and the Boltons. Roderick Cassel rides from Winterfell to try to settle things with the war between the Boltons and the Manderleys, taking a lot of the Winterfell Guard with him. What this means is that most of the North is involved in fighting each other rather than focused on any external threat which might be coming. Speaking of which, surprise! The Greyjoys are enormous pieces of shit who suck so hard, so hard, and they invade along the Stony Shore and the west coast of the north, as long as Victarion heading up to Moat Cailin. Theon hatches his scheme to have Dagmar Cleftjaw attack Torrhen Square to draw Roderick Stark away from Winterfell, while he, as in Theon, moves towards Winterfell itself. So Roderick Cassel wheels around to respond to this new threat, taking almost all of the remaining guard with him from Winterfell to repel Dagmar's attack on Torrhen Square. And that's where we find ourselves here at the precipice of the fall of the Stark cause. All of the plot points that started in A Game of Thrones have cascaded to this moment of overall tragedy for the Starks and for Bran Stark in particular.
And then all of a sudden, we're back with Bran in his bed. George is out to disorient the reader in order to get us into Bran's confused, frightened headspace. Yet, even as Bran jolts back into his body from that of his wolf, feeling an echo of Summer's pain, confused about what's happening and why, George is paying off multiple elements of his story at the same time. This is the moment in which Bran gives up the refusal of the call from the hero's journey. He fully and finally accepts that Jojen, his magical mentor, was telling the truth about everything all along. I am a beastling after all. Didn't I just have an extended wolf dream in which Summer's actions were driven by the knowledge and backstory of me inside him? That cannot be explained by anything but warging. In the same paragraph, George reminds us of Jojen's prophecies, delivered too late to save anyone, only helping Bran understand his fate when it's already too late. The sea has come, and knowing it didn't help. The wolves howl, the dogs howl, Bran howls, and the gods are silent, forsaking them one and all.
Forsaken, ding. I mean, back in the Game of Thrones, Bran spent most of his third chapter falling from a tower with death below and the three-eyed crow above him, challenging him to fly. And it was the moment where Bran was introduced to his magical side, the ability to open his third eye, which culminates in him becoming the last Green Seer, come the wind's winter next week. And here we have a similar moment where another fall forces Bran to acknowledge that he's not merely a green seer. Bran, as you were saying, finally admits that he's a warg and Jojen was right about his ability and everything else. Prior to this chapter, Bran was in denial about his ability, knowing that he was in Summer in his dreams in some way, yet denying that it was anything more than a dream. And that's a interesting narrative current which George integrates into A Song of Ice and Fire, which has characters recognizing something intrinsic about themselves in their moments of dire wolf peril. Of course, Summer's tumble from the tree is less dangerous than Bran's near-death experience after Jaime pushed him from the Winterfell Tower. And so Bran's move here is to stop denying his ability, a rather less momentous act than flying from the death that reached up towards him in Bran's third chapter in A Game of Thrones. So too, George has this thing where people are realizing something integral to the plot or about themselves prior to a major twist in the narrative. I mean, think about, in A Dance with Dragons when Tyrion reveals that he knows that young Griff's true identity as Aegon the Sixth Targaryen just before the Bridge of Dreams is cited a second time. And here comes this twist, but it's not a magical twist. It's a much more ordinary, brutish twist.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's, you have these like shamanic characters like Bran who oftentimes have some kind of terrible injury to kind of cue them into their powers or make their powers possible. And that goes hand in hand with Bran as a kind of Fisher King archetype, because the whole idea of the Fisher King is you get a very telling wound in your thigh/crotch area. It means you can't propagate, you can't get the land going, and suddenly the land falls into disrepair. And Bran is exactly this kind of character. But as always in A Clash of Kings, politics are at work, as well as magic. Two forces, two kinds of power, always intertwining and affecting one another. The reason no one is heeding Bran and Summer's warning is the same reason that no one, except Alebelly, that is, heeded Jojen's warning. People place a higher premium on political power than magical power because it's visible, it's tangible. We treat them as opposites rather than bringing their insights together as one. In the political domain, Winterfell is all but empty of men to respond to Bran's call, because Theon's ploy worked. Sir Roderick took all the men in the area to go fight Dagmar Cleftjaw at Torrhen Square. As soon as the reader learns that, we realize with horror that it is Winterfell that Theon meant to take back in Theon 3, and that's exactly what he's doing right now. George moves quickly through this section of the chapter, in part, I think, because he knows the plot beats that make this possible are somewhat suspect. It really doesn't make sense that Roderick all but abandoned the Stark home and the Stark heirs in the midst of what is now clearly an Ironborn invasion. I mean, Roderick knows where Dagmar comes from, right? Who he works for? Do lone wolf sea raiders typically lay siege to inland castles? I don't think so. But Roderick has to take everyone for the plot to work, because even a couple dozen extra men at Winterfell right now would stop Theon in his tracks. This is not due to unusual carelessness on the author's part, but rather just the difficulty of rewriting the Sack of Winterfell plot to fit Theon and Ramsay. Back in the initial story outline, Tyrion was the one to burn the Stark castle. Presumably, he would have done so with a sizable Lannister army. As the story developed, however, George decided to stage Tyrion's rise and fall around his relationships with his family down in King's Landing, which I think was the right move, and also decided that the Boltons instead would be the primary heels in the north, the primary anti-Stark force in the north. So while George needs the Ironborn invasion to succeed just enough to get Bran on his way and influence Robb and Catelyn's decisions down in the Riverlands, he also needs the Ironborn to fail just enough so that the Boltons can easily take over and become the heels of the north. That is a difficult balance to strike. And so George wound up hinging it on what I think are some kind of flimsy and forced plot beats. Enough whining. I promise to never bring it up again. I made my point. This is still gripping, devastating stuff to read. And George makes up for some story weaknesses with great character work for both Bran and Theon. First, a stranger comes through the door in response to Bran's call. And he's frightened by that, as of course he would be. But then he's relieved when Theon walks through the door next. Because Theon is his foster brother. Theon is someone very familiar to Bran, someone from his old life before the fall. The reader, of course, is not relieved at all, because we've been in Theon's head in his own chapters. We know what's up. We're trying to just reach through the page and warn Bran that Theon is no longer on his side. And Theon's first words are so telling. "We're not here to harm you, Bran. Smash cut to Theon hunting Bran through the woods and then claiming to have killed him. Theon feigns diplomacy, but he can't get past the brutality of what he has come here to do. And we will see this in full later in the chapter and in Theon's own chapters later in this book. Bran, for the moment, thinks that Theon has been sent by Robb, that Robb might be here too. Oh, how heartbreaking is that? That's like the Civil War, the costs of the Civil War at its most intimate.
Yeah, and the irony is that Robb did kind of send Theon in this direction with his order to have Theon bring his letter to Balon Greyjoy proposing the alliance between the Starks and the Greyjoys. And this is a piece of the structure of tragedy I think that George does really, really well. The good intentions of Robb Stark have led to unmitigated disaster at the home front, a disaster which will essentially seal the doom of the Stark cause and Robb's cause particularly. The playwright Gustav Freytag, hope I'm getting that name right, wrote about the structure of tragedy in theater, in which he talked about the 5 phases of tragedy: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and of course, catastrophe. For Robb, Catelyn, and the Stark cause, this is the climax of the tragedy. Or as Freytag puts it, the climax can be thought of as a reflection point. If things have gone well for the protagonists, at the climax, they start to fall apart tragically. As we talked about last week for Catelyn's 6th chapter in Clash, everything has gone really well for Robb and his subordinate commanders. They've won every battle, they've pantsed Tywin Lannister and his smooth-brained henchmen at every turn. Tywin is pinned down in the Riverlands, retreating towards the Blackwater Brush, while the remainder of the Lannister host is in the west and scattered. And here in Winterfell, everything falls apart for our hero, Robb Stark. But in true tragic lens, it's fallen apart due to the actions of our would-be protagonist, Robb Stark. If Robb had listened to his mom like you should, you always got to listen to your mom, and even with Balon Greyjoy planning to invade the north anyways, the Ironborn invasion would have not likely culminated with Theon Greyjoy taking Winterfell, because Theon wouldn't have actually been in the north, actually controlling a small amount of soldiers in the north and having knowledge of the land. Asha, Victarion, Aaron, and Dagmar, they don't know the North. They don't know the temperament and personality of Leopold Tallheart or how Roger Cassell would respond to the threat against Torrance Square. But Theon knew. He had been raised as Ned Stark's ward and had traveled with his lord throughout the North and gained the know-how of the inner workings of the North. And so Robb inadvertently created the tragic climax to the Stark cause. Next to come is the slow falling action, followed only by the catastrophe of the Red Wedding. And again, this week, as in last week, I'm sad.
And yeah, and a small point that, it probably doesn't make sense that Roderick took so many men with him going to protect Torrance Square, but it reminds me a little bit of Ned in A Game of Thrones when he basically sends half of his own personal guard to go after the mountain, which was also not the greatest decision.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. They're definitely reacting like, oh, the thing I'm supposed to protect. Let's go, everybody. And it's, I think it might be George, taking the piss out of the automatic hero's instinct a little bit and forcing people to think things through on a political level. I think that's definitely a good point. Bran still thinks of Theon as a protector in this moment, the man who saved his life in the woods outside Winterfell back in Book 1. And so Theon has to tell Bran that no, he comes now as a conqueror, as an enemy. Theon tells Bran that Robb can't help him now, and Bran is confused by this, naturally, because last he knew, Theon and Robb were friends. Theon's explanation is again so telling. It's Prince Theon now, Bran. Gotta respect my title. That's Theon's overweening ego and desperately thin skin coming to the fore. He's so brittle that he demands obeisance from a scared child. We're both princes, Bran. Who could have believed it? That's a little part of Theon's more like naive songs and stories heart coming out. That's a flicker of nostalgia, of mutual wonder. Look, we're princes. But it crashes on the political realities. They're princes of different kingdoms. Theon dismisses the other Ironborn man and sits on Bran's bed, just like it's the old times. He tells Bran that he sent men over the walls to open a gate. Bran still can't quite wrap his head around the idea that Theon is now on a different side of the war, that this man he grew up with is now a dedicated foe as much as the Lannisters. Remember, Bran was born a little after the Greyjoy Rebellion, Balon's first rebellion, so he has never known a time that Theon didn't live at Winterfell. And so he says, your father's ward. But Ned is dead, and now Theon has struck out on his own. The old world, the old bonds of peacetime fall apart in the war and as Bran grows up. Theon tells Bran that he and Rickon are now his wards. I don't know how literally Theon means that. I think he might just be reveling in the power inversion. The Starks are now in his control. I don't know if he's necessarily talking about literal wardship as the custom goes in Westeros. But by naming Bran and Rickon his wards, Theon is bringing them officially under his protection, making him all the more a pariah when he claims to have killed them. Theon demands Bran's culpability in this. You have to be complicit in your own conquest. He tells him to officially surrender Winterfell because Theon realizes that the people are going to follow Bran's lead, ultimately not his. Bran, spunky little fantasy protagonist that he is, insists that his people will fight and throw Theon out. Theon tells Bran not to play the boy. Well, that's a telling phrase because it's just the phrase that Ned and Robb and Jon used to get Bran to grow up. Don't play the boy. Again, a reminder that Theon is turning on what was his own home. That's a phrase he learned from the very people he's fighting now. Ironically, Theon is the one who continually plays the boy in Winterfell. He's immature, he's self-centered, he's pointlessly aggressive. Bran, despite being so much younger, is the one who sets his pride aside and does what is best for his people. As Theon says, those people are still Bran's responsibility, and Bran lives up to that. Yet Theon neglects his own responsibility as the new Lord of Winterfell. And this naked threat to the lives of Winterfell's residents is another sign how poorly this is going to go.
Wait, this is not going to be Theon's triumph in A Song of Ice and Fire?
Perish the thought.
I know, so strange. You've been bringing this up since Theon's second chapter, Emmett, but I've been struck by this idea of viewing these chapters through the lens of a character who doesn't actually get the point of view in the particular chapter. And I'm equally intrigued by moments in the story when two established point of view characters are in one place together and how they would have differing perspectives on the same event. And I think we were talking about this in pre-production, but George, I think, did a really good job of selecting Bran as the point of view character because he's emphasizing the mood for the protagonist, in quotation marks, side of A Song of Ice and Fire, tragedy and downfall. For Theon, this is a moment of Victorian-esque triumph, albeit one where he comes off like a total fucking jackass. But what's going on inside Theon's head when all this is going down? So the question's been kind of popping through my mind. I mean, Theon's machismo in his first three chapters in A Clash of Kings is total overcompensation for the vain, shallow boy inside of a man's body. And I think we're continuing to see that onto here in Winterfell. And ain't that Theon Greyjoy in A Clash of Kings? And ain't the tragedy and foreboding the cornerstone of Bran Stark's entire arc in A Clash of Kings too?
I think you said it exactly right. We're seeing Theon not from his own head where he's victorious and this is his best moment. We're seeing him from the outside, and not even from the POV of someone who's contemptuous towards him, but someone who used to trust him. And there's that great moment in the show when Isaac Hempstead Wright says to Theon, "Did you hate us the whole time?" And Theon just doesn't know what to say to that because the answer is at one level, yeah, of course I did. I was your prisoner. But he's actually still too attached to them and too detached from his Ironborn family to really say that. He's caught in between. As I mentioned earlier, my favorite aspect of Bran 6 is that even while the plot is changing, the character work is consistent with what's come before. Bran's sudden fall from power does not render moot the previous discussions of doing one's princely duties. Those duties are more important than ever because they've been infused with immediate life or death urgency. This is no longer just, a training exercise. This is the real deal. Bran's test here starts the same way his storyline in A Clash of Kings started. When Theon leaves the room, Bran is back in the exact position he was at the opening of his first chapter in this book, staring out the window, hating his powerlessness over the world he ostensibly rules over. He wishes he was still inside Summer, because then he could run and fight and hear and smell. But then again, Summer still couldn't save the day. You could say that Summer's cage is a metaphor for Bran's cage. Summer can run and fight and hear and smell, but he's stuck inside the Godswood, so what good does it do him? Bran isn't stuck inside the Godswood, but he can't run, nor fight, nor can he hear or smell anything like Summer can. His self is divided, split. It's the warg self versus the prince self we've been talking about in these Bran chapters, and the whole point of his hero's journey is to reconcile the two. That struggle has, in part, taken the form of Bran's competing mentors, the sorceress Jojen Reed and the secular Maester Luwin, who comes in now. He tells Bran how Theon's men took the castle, killing Alebelly in the process, just as Jojen prophesied. Luwin says that he never saw this threat coming, but Bran internally confirms that Jojen, the magical mentor, did. Of course, that's not to say that Lewin is now like obsolete or anything like that. He still has an important role to play in this chapter as Bran's political mentor.
Yes, and in this moment, Maester Lewin is here addressing Bran as a prince and discussing the importance of looking princely for the surrender. And it kind of reminds me of Bran in A Game of Thrones, eternally remarking that sometimes when he speaks to his brother Robb, it's his brother that he's always loved. But sometimes Robb has to put on what he describes as the stern face of Robb the Lord. Once his parents leave, he has more responsibility, and he has to present this image to take care of his people. And here, Bran has to do the same. But of course, Bran is still just a boy, right? And he's very scared. And this reminds me of something else from actually Bran's very first chapter in A Game of Thrones, when he's speaking with Ned, and he's like, "But Dad, basically, how can I be brave, right, when I'm so afraid?" And Ned remarks back to him, "You can only be brave when you are afraid." So this is one of those moments that, yes, Ned is dead, but you can see him living on through the life lessons that he taught his children. And in this moment, Bran, by putting on the face of the Lord, is truly committing a brave act.
Yeah, I totally agree. He's living up to the best of Ned, what Ned taught him from his very first chapter, his very first POV chapter forward, when we heard that line about you can only be brave when you're afraid. That's the meaning of that wolf's head clasp that Bran says he likes so much in that scene. That's why that's powerful. And he is prepared to live up to Ned's example. And unfortunately, Theon is not. Lewin tries to explain that by saying that cruel places breed cruel people. A statement that is probably too complex to fully break down here. I think it is both true and insufficient. It is true that the old way, the practice of reaving on the Iron Islands, is ultimately rooted in the lack of resources on the Iron Islands. But then how do you explain the new way, the Ironborn more interested in trade, like Quelon Greyjoy or Roderick the Reader? Material explanations and cultural explanations are both necessary. And it's not like Theon personally was ever actually deprived of anything. More to the point, though, Theon's cruelty was not bred on the Iron Islands, because he left the Iron Islands when he was 9. It comes from the combination of his two cultures. It comes from feeling like he can't quite be that guy, so he has to try all the harder. Theon is trying to live up to the ideal of the old way with such desperation because he doesn't really belong there. Ned's efforts to gentle him, as Lewin put it, I don't really think they were too little too late. I think they were just successful enough to doom Theon and make sure he would never be at home in either place.
Right, the combination of just a little bit too little, a little bit too much at the same time is the thing that influences Theon to become the person that he is. And one aspect of Theon that underpins his story is how he's felt alienated from every father figure he's ever encountered. Balon and Ned were both cold to him, and I find Lewin's statement that Ned tried to gentle Theon a little bit off-putting. Not to give Theon too much sympathy in this chapter where he's just a fucking dick throughout, but we have to at least acknowledge that statement should at least kind of have us tilting our heads. As Theon thinks he lived in fear of Ned Stark and the great sword that's hung over him his entire life. Theon is a product of, let's call it, less than a less than ideal nurturing system that hung over him. As we talked in Theon's third chapter about how Dagmar was the only warm fatherly figure in Theon's life. But Bran says in this chapter that that old Nan has called Dagmar a monstrous war chief who could not be killed. For Ned Stark's legacy, we have kind of a Dagmar effect going on where most of the point of view characters think rather warmly and fondly of him, given that they are, of course, blood relatives or married to him. But Theon doesn't have that perspective. Theon's perspective, and it's an important one, recontextualizes Ned to where he's not the warm fatherly figure. To Theon, Ned is practically the monstrous war chief that Nan says that Dagmar Cleftjaw was. Now, objectively speaking, Ned Stark is still preferable to your Dagmar Cleftjaws in this world, and definitely preferable to the Balon Greyjoys and then the Ramsay Boltons. But the callous, selfish young man who takes Winterfell with a bubble of resentment surrounding him is as much the product of Balon's old way ideology, and as you were saying, and Ned Stark's role as the hostage taker and holder of Theon Greyjoy.
Certainly, people with no good options are going to fall back on violence. We saw that in King's Landing in the last couple Tyrion chapters. But I don't think the same argument quite applies to Theon, nor do I think it quite applies to the young Walder Freys, who come up again in this chapter. Their cruelty was not bred by their natural environment, but by their family environment. When Big Walder tells Bran that Robb has lost his kingdom, that he, Bran, is no prince but a hostage, immediately abandoning any connection to them, what Big Walder is reflecting, what Little Walder actually, I think, what Little Walder is reflecting there is the ruthless competitive ambition of the adults who raised him. The Freys' loyalty is skin deep. They are instinctively eager to get on board with a bully like them. When Jojen points out that really they've all been made equal, they're all hostages, they're all equally powerless now, Little Walder responds with a slur. Because that's the hierarchy of power he believes in. The likes of Jojen and Hodor, and probably Bran due to his disability, are subhuman and beneath contempt. And of course, the old way of the Ironborn is founded on exactly that idea. So no wonder the Freys and the Greyjoys can kind of get along. They have really the kind of the same worldviews. Meanwhile, poor young Rickon just wants his family back. And that's the aching human need under all these larger structures. Theon, too, wants his family back deep down. And this is the only way he can conceive of getting the other Greyjoys to love him. Luwin takes Rickon's hand and reassures him that he is loved. That's what Dagmar tried to do for Theon, but in that case, I think it really was an attempt at gentleness that just came too little and too late.
Agreed. I think it's really tough for Theon in that he didn't really have any people that truly loved him. But people who do love their surrogate sons is an interesting feature of A Clash of Kings, because there's this dynamic of maesters serving as surrogate fathers to sad second sons, like Bran, like Stannis. Sting at Dragonstone, Crescent loved Stannis and tried to be a dad to the sad boy who stood in the shadows of his older brother, Robert. And here at Winterfell, Luwin tries to be a dad to both Bran and Rickon here, sharing hard truths with them about the state of things at Winterfell. But Luwin also kind of acts in a kind of motherly role as kind of a mom to these kids here too, because Rickon, as you were saying, calls for his mom, and Luwin offers, I don't know if this is a bad thing to say, but Luwin offers almost motherly comfort to Rickon, reminding the boy that Catelyn is far away, but Mama Luwin is here with hugs and comfort for his boys.
I don't think that's a bad thing to say at all. I think that's quite deliberate. George is framing that when he says that Catelyn's not here and Luwin is having to play that role too. Catelyn herself said she had to play both son and daughter to foster. It's not so much, I think, that George is saying these are the inherent roles of gender. It's more just these are the roles of gender in this society.
Sure. And
sometimes individuals have to live up to two of those roles at once, which is true, I think, in our society too, with our own gender roles. How sometimes people have to flip-flop between them. It's, that's just part of life and part of parentage. And so the castle's inhabitants are gathered into the Great Hall to witness a political transformation. One Prince of Winterfell giving way to another. The great irony here is that while Theon utterly failed to prove himself as an Ironborn leader on Pike, he knows the northern trappings of power very well. And of course he does, because he's been living here for years. So while Theon can't seem to take a step on the Iron Islands without revealing how little he belongs there, he knows exactly how to signify his conquest of Winterfell, sitting himself in the high seat of the Starks. It's a moment of such primal political power that even Rickon is able to pick up on what's happening here. Theon's sitting in Robb's chair. Bran, a little older, can pick up on the mood in the room, so he tells Rickon to hush. The people of Winterfell are gradually driven into the hall. Some are crying, some are wounded, and it's clear even before Theon makes it explicit in his next chapter that Paula was assaulted. When Septon Chael tries to help her, he's knocked to the ground. He wasn't rebelling. All he was doing was trying to help Paula. How would that hurt the Ironborn at all? All of which is to say that even before Theon opens his mouth, the notion that he and his men are indistinguishable, as he says, from Ned and his men is bullshit. And then the Ironborn bring in, quote-unquote, Reek. Even in Bran's panicked state, he takes a moment to feel disgust with the Reek. And that's kind of a nudge in the ribs from George, like, hey, I know we're focusing on the Greyjoys right now, but pay attention to this guy. I love how Reek is introduced here. He says they call him Reek, one of the Ironborn says. And that really stands out on reread. Yeah, they call him Reek, but that's not his true name. He's playing a role, like Bran and Theon. Ramsay's first spoken line in the series is about his rapacious desires. Haven't fucked no one since they took me. Ramsay revels in sadistic sex play. That's what's driving him in this moment. He wants to get back to the power that allowed him to do that. Theon finds, quote-unquote, Reek amusing. Another very bad sign about how this will go. You really should not find this guy amusing. I think it's so telling that when Theon learns that Ramsay married Lady Hornwood, he's like baffled and surprised. Like, what? She wasn't sexy. What other motive could there be? Well, as Ramsay himself like patiently explains to Theon, he didn't wed her for her teats, my lord. He wed her for her castle and her lands. As much as Ramsay is driven by his sadistic desires, he also does have cunning, and we see that displayed here as well. The fact that Theon can't even comprehend these ambitions is another bad sign for him. That's like a real lack of political intelligence on Theon's part, that he can't realize why Lady Horn would be valuable beyond just, a tumble in the hay. Bran also possesses political intelligence, despite his age. He quickly realizes that, hey, the Ironborn don't really have enough men to hold on for long. You got 30 guys, Theon? Mm-hmm. And that is in part why Mikken defies Theon so boldly. Theon swaggers in here like he's conquered the North single-handedly, rather than temporarily taking a single castle with a few dozen guys. His opening line to the people is again very telling. You all know me. Yeah, they do. And that's the problem. They see him as a traitor, not a returning friend. They hate him far more than they hate his fellow Ironborn, precisely because they're familiar with him. The rest are just strangers. But that bond meant nothing to Theon, apparently, since he comes in here as a conqueror. So why should it mean anything to them? Bran tells Mikken to be silent. He tries to maintain the Lord's face that Stanford was talking about earlier, but unlike Ned or Robb, he can't do it. He's a scared little kid, and so his voice squeaks. Still, that's not the true test of courage. The true test is speaking up, even in a squeaky voice, to declare that he has surrendered Winterfell in order to keep his people safe.
Exactly. Bran is still a boy, but he displays courage by surrendering Winterfell, which probably keeps a lot of his people safe and saves lives. As characters say, when the Lord play their games of thrones, it's usually the small folks that suffer. And as an African proverb, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So here, Bran, he's only a boy, but he's trying to make the decision. He's making the decision, actually, that saves the lives of the small folks, tries to prevent the grass from suffering. And it kind of reminds me of Edmure, I believe, in Catelyn 5 that you guys did just maybe a couple of weeks ago, when Edmure says, well, my people are here in the castle because my people, they were afraid. Mm-hmm. He's trying to value, he's actually living up to the feudal contract and valuing the small folks' lives.
Exactly, living up to the oath, to the contract. He's displaying the substance of the Starks, whereas Theon can only access the surface, the chair, being in charge, and so he cannot win the people's loyalty. As Mikken says, Theon can't hold the North that way, especially with so few men. Unfortunately, Mikken dies for this defiance. Jojen's prophecies just keep coming true. And really, what a waste of resources that is to kill Winterfell's smith. That's a valuable guy. Remember how they keep Gendry alive at Harrenhal because he's so useful as a smith? And Theon will later spoil the well with Septon Chael's body. The well, Theon, you're about to come under siege? You might need a well. The Ironborn claim the North by right of conquest, but do nothing to actually set up and maintain their empire in the long term. Because the old way has made them this way. They're just bullies, following their violent instincts towards short-term domination. Nothing makes this more clear than when Theon declares he'll be as good a lord as Ned Stark, but he has to raise his voice to be heard over the sound of his men beating poor Hodor into silence, something Ned would never have permitted. Actions speak louder than words, and Theon only wants to be like Ned Stark to the extent that it means being in charge. Bran is the true Prince of Winterfell.
He absolutely is. And I'm always reminded in these moments of how Ned Stark governed himself as Lord Stark and the loyalty he engendered through his governance. The type of loyalty that Ned had was earned from the Northmen is one that was both inherited because he is a Stark, and also earned too. I mean, Ned was the son of Rickard Stark, we should admit that as much, but he also gave a place at the table to the Winterfell staff. He visited small and high lords in the north and ingratiated himself with the population. Ned knew all of his men, their cares, their troubles. Don't let your men die for a stranger, he tells Robb Stark. Know your men. This is why the Mountain Clansmen marched for the Ned's Girl and a Dance with Dragons. Had Ned only opted for the I'm in charge because of my father, he wouldn't have really gained the passion and love of his people, really, the same dynamic that is displayed multiple times in the series. Theon here does not have a Stark surname, and he couldn't play the nice guy at Winterfell or lose face to the Ironborn Reavers who took the castle for him. As a result, Theon is in a no-win situation with also no leg to stand on. He's no Stark, and he's not able to earn the loyalty of the inhabitants of Winterfell by being the guy who knows his people and knows his men the same way that Ned Stark does. And as a result, we see Theon failing even as he starts to win.
And, Theon's failure to win over the people is not exactly subtly conveyed in this scene. It's very obvious. But Theon doesn't want to see that. As in his own chapters, Theon is transparently lying to himself in an effort to reconcile his bifurcated identity. He concocts a scenario here in which Robb would just be happy to remain as the king of the Trident down in the Riverlands. When, of course, that's not true. Robb, as we're going to see in the Storm of Swords, will retake the North or die trying. But so why does Theon even come up with this scenario? Why does he bother? Well, because unlike his family, Theon doesn't actually think of Robb as a hated enemy. The rest of his family would be like, yeah, hope Robb dies down there. That would be very useful to us if Robb dies against the Lannisters. But Theon doesn't want that to happen. So he's to imagine the situation in which I'm in charge up here and Robb is in charge down there. Maybe we'll still be friends. That's a complete delusion. But what else is he supposed to think about what he's doing? Even as Theon rises to power, all the warning signs about his downfall to come are readily apparent to pretty much everyone except him.
Yes, and on reread, you actually notice when Reek, or really Ramsay, enters the scene, he's very clever. He knows too much about the value of the Hornwood lands and the Manderleys in general. And I think that's a small hint from George that Reek is more than he appears. And that hint stands out big time on a reread. And as you mentioned, Theon knows the trappings of power in the North, but he's either delusional or lying about his ability to hold the North. It's very funny. Oh, we're going to take Deepwood Mott. Oh, my uncle's coming with reinforcements. His uncle's not coming to Winterfell with reinforcements. And I just think it's a small LOL moment that both of the people in this chapter who just quickly want to pledge fealty to Theon in this chapter, Reek and Osha, have no intention at all to actually keep that fealty. And Theon probably should have actually considered the fact that the people who were too quick to serve him may have had ulterior motives.
That's a great point. Even as he's building his empire, every new addition to his team is not actually on his side. As you say, Theon fails the test of Reek in multiple respects. He doesn't wonder about ulterior motives. He doesn't wonder why a mere serving man has such a handle on northern politics. And he doesn't internalize the warning that there are plenty of Northmen left around here to fight and kick out the Ironborn. For Bran, this is devastating because Jojen's prophecies, again, just keep coming true. Next up would be this Reek fellow skinning off Bran and Rickon's faces. As rereaders, of course, we know that Theon is sealing his own horrible doom here, not Bran's. Now, as first-time readers, I can only speak for myself, but I definitely didn't realize that something was terribly wrong with this Reek fellow, even as I'm outlining all these reasons why. Because George keeps distracting us. He keeps our focus elsewhere. The scene doesn't linger on Reek. It immediately moves on to Osha scorning the Starks and swearing loyalty to Theon. And like Bran, we're stunned by this betrayal. I agree that it's funny how neither of Theon's new soldiers have any intention of staying loyal, just for complete opposite reasons. There is no foundation to his rule. So even as Bran and Hodor disappear into darkness and despair at the end of this chapter, Theon can hardly be said to have won. And by the time we get back to his POV, it will all have already fallen apart. From here, Bran vanishes for the rest of the book, before emerging at the very end of A Clash of Kings for one more chapter. The prince, the heir, the king of Westeros to be, is waiting in the wings as the Civil War reaches its furious heights both here and at King's Landing, resuming only at the end to help rebuild the world.
Yeah, and the previous chapter had Catelyn realize that Arya wasn't present when Cleos Frey was in the Red Keep, and this leads Cat to wonder whether Arya's gone missing. Cersei too admits to Tyrion at the start of A Clash of Kings that no one had seen Arya after Meryn Trant faced down that hero Syrio Forel. And after the Purple Wedding, Sansa too will disappear from King's Landing and pose incognito as Elaine Stone in the Vale. As you say, this is the final spot many of the people in Winterfell will see Bran before he disappears, along with Rickon and the Direwolves. And though Wex will glimpse Bran and Rickon alive and departing the Godswood, the Starks, you get the sense that the Starks are disappearing into the ether of the story. And it has me thinking of kind of Arthurian legend and how George might be inspired by some of the traditional storytelling tropes that surround Arthurian legend. There's almost an Avalon-like feeling of the badly wounded Starks who will live on in the story, disappearing into the mists of Avalon in order to recover and then return to save the world in its most dire moment.
I think that's great. You got to walk the domain of death and take that part of the hero's journey. And you can see that in so many characters. Aragorn has to walk the literal paths of the dead, in the mists and fog behind the scenes, everyone assuming he's going to die before he can return in triumph to Minas Tirith to save the day. And Bran has his own version of that arc.
Mm-hmm. And I think we'll wrap us up for our depth portion of this episode, for transitioning to foreshadowing and groundwork. So the taking of Winterfell, because the castle is undermanned due to most of the fighting men being away from this castle, is something we're going to see again in 2 weeks' time with Roose Bolton taking Harrenhal when most of the men are away from the castle itself. But it's also how Jon Connington takes Storm's End, as most of the fighting men who would normally defend Griffin's Roost are off with Red Run at Connington at Maidenpool or way up north with Stannis. It's kind of a trope that George starts to use a few times as his story progresses from A Clash of Kings.
Yes, and in this very chapter, Ramsay/Reek tells Theon that the Stark Lords will rebel against them, especially the Manderleys. And when you fast forward to A Dance with Dragons, you have the Manderleys working with other Stark Lords, basically trying to put a Stark in power. But the irony is they're trying to rebel against the Boltons and Ramsay.
Yeah, you both make great points. But putting those two together, you have like the situation where the North has to be scattered for the moment to allow Theon to succeed. But then that also keeps just enough men around in the North that you have a kind of a loyalist force that can put the Starks back in power. And I think that's set up in the earlier books. Some people have said that the Mountain Clans in A Dance with Dragons kind of come out of nowhere, that George just kind of came up with them as an army, to be useful, so that the pro-Stark side has some people on their side. But we talk about them quite a bit in A Storm of Swords when Bran passes through their territories. We're going to get into. So I think George is setting up that he wants just enough loyal men in the North to reform, as the Starks are going to reform from scattered to the Four Winds back at Winterfell, and the North will reforge on the kind of the values the Starks keep alive and that survive the threat coming from Theon.
Right. And I think too, even though the North has enough men to have this kind of interesting dynamic at the end of A Dance with Dragons, we still have to remember that, was it 40,000-ish people are down with Robb Stark in the Riverlands? And what is it that Stannis says? He's got 5,000 or so men, to include his own dudes that he's marching on Winterfell with. And Ramsay's got 5,000 to 6,000 dudes as well. 11,000 is a little bit of if I'm not a math guy, but I think 11,000 is fewer.
Either is George, so that's okay.
Right, that's true. George, was it Steve Abel said there's a hashtag George can't math, which is on Tumblr apparently, which is a really good thing. I think that kind of rolls us into our theory discussion portion of it, because this chapter is something that we have a reference to in one of the Winds Winter sample chapters, and that's namely the fall of Winterfell and Theon's role in it in A Clash of Kings. And of course, the king brings this up.
Yes, indeed. As we see from Theon's release chapter from the Winds of Winter, this might not be the only time that Winterfell falls in the series. In A Dance with Dragons, the Boltons and their Frey allies are occupying it, but Stannis is on the march. Theon is now in Stannis' camp since he escaped Winterfell with Jane Poole, and so the potential emerges for a great closed loop aspect of Theon's arc, where he's going to help take the castle for a second time, but potentially, for good this time, for the side of good this time, or at least relatively good.
I mean, better than the Greyjoys and the Boltons for sure.
The non-Bolton side, exactly.
Right, the non-Bolton side. The slightly better. I mean, much better compared to the Boltons, I guess. So in the Theon Winds of Winter chapter, Stannis is having this conversation, and he says, "I know what the king indicated Theon, what he wants." That Stannis talking about Theon. Wool wants him dead. Flint, Nori, all of them want him dead. For the boys he slew, vengeance for their precious Ned. Will you oblige them? Just now, the Turncloak is more use to me alive. He is knowledge we may need. So the question I have for you, gentlemen, this evening is, what is the knowledge that Stannis hopes to grab from Theon in order to take Winterfell from the Boltons and take it out from under him?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think the knowledge that Theon has is probably different than the knowledge that Stannis actually wants, right? Like Theon can actually reveal, oh, maybe Bran and Rickon are still alive. And that's information that Stannis may or may not know. I think Stannis is probably looking, well, Theon maybe knows who's in the castle, how much forces there are. Possibly right. Theon could tell him about the whole Manderley Boltons fighting in the food hall, and maybe that gives Stannis the idea to try to contact them. But I'm not actually sure.
I like that idea, because that kind of fits Stannis' story, where he often, what ends up helping or hurting him ends up being something out of his control or that he didn't expect. Like, in A Storm of Swords, he thinks I'm going to gain power through Edric Storm, but Davos gives him a different way of doing it. I think that I like that a lot. We see the birds in Theon's released Winds of Winter chapter shouting out his name. It's probably Bran and Bloodraven, so that's likely to come into play. But yeah, Theon, he took Winterfell with a handful of men. Stannis might not have the same ability just to go over the walls like that. But Theon, as we see in that release chapter, he knows the personalities of the people on the other side. He knows how to fool them. And so maybe that has some part to play in terms of how Stannis ends up faking his death. What do you think, Jeff?
So I was thinking about this, and it kind of dawned on me as we were doing this analysis on Bran's 6th chapter in A Clash of Kings that George might be doing another dynamic where the men have all the fighting men have been scattered away from Winterfell. Namely, because we know that Roose Bolton has dispatched the Freys and the Manderleys from Winterfell in order to take down Stannis Baratheon at the Crofters' village. Now, something that kind of dawns on me too about this is that is emptying Winterfell of people who are fiercely anti-Bolton, but also people who are more Bolton loyalists in the form of the Freys. But Theon also says something interesting in that I was about to say that Stannis wins the Winter chapter, and that Theon wins the Winter chapter. Pretty much. I mean, we talk about this over and over again about how it's basically a Stannis point of view chapter. It's great. He says that Ramsay is also coming too, and it kind of dawned on me that maybe this is the way that George ends up exploring the dynamic in the Winds of Winter of having a confrontation between. This was way out of the blue, of having Jon Snow and Ramsay come into conflict because Ramsay won't actually be in the castle of Winterfell when Stannis takes it, which will then prevent him from actually being killed by Stannis Baratheon for all his numerous crimes. Ramsay goes back to the Dreadfort. Jon Snow comes out of the wall and from Castle Black and ends up. I have not figured out the Winterfell plot for Stannis and Jon yet by any stretch, and I imagine George might not yet either.
Right, that's why we're still waiting.
But
we can be fairly confident that there's going to be a Jon Snow Ramsay confrontation. At least Game of Thrones season 6, The Battle of the Bastards, had that as being a something that we would potentially see. And I think that George has indicated too that having this idea of there should be a direwolves versus dogs fight, which we need to set up here in season 4 when he was conversing with the showrunners from Game of Thrones. And that has led a lot of folks to believe that there's going to be a confrontation between Ramsay and Jon. So I think that's a way that we could see this happen, that Stannis takes Winterfell with just a few dudes, and maybe they get over the walls, or maybe they're just let in because they pose as Freys and Karstarks. These are theories that have been in existence in the fandom for a long time now. But I think the idea of having most of the Bolton loyalist men out of Winterfell itself would provide a standpoint from which we could see a fulfilling endpoint, which does utilize the unspecific knowledge of taking a castle when it's undermanned and underdefended.
I like that a lot. Part of it I always thought, we've had this emphasis on the Battle of Ice, which of course is George's term for it, and it's Stannis versus Hastine Frey at the Crofters' village, and that battle itself is not super important, right? Because it's the only thing at stake there is Hastine Frey and his little army. And I wonder if George is emphasizing that because the fall of Winterfell itself won't actually be a battle. Like, there's not going to be that many men, and they're going to take it quickly or by surprise. So the big set piece is the Battle of Ice. And then Winterfell itself is going to fall in a more, with guile or subterfuge, like the way Storm's End is going to fall to John Connington. And yeah, I've always had conflicts about what happens with Ramsay, because I'm like, well, I don't think Stannis can't really outright lose, unlike in the show, because he still has to burn Shireen, and Shireen's not with him on the march, unlike the show. But also, I definitely see the appeal of a Jon Ramsay showdown, because they're both bastards and they're such opposites, and it was set up with the pink letter. So that, some combination therein. I could see people are talking in the chat about how the appeal of Ramsay's dogs being set on him, like they were in the show, and Theon brings it up in the books. Maybe Jon as Ghost leads the dog pack against Ramsay or some such. I could definitely see that going down. But yeah, I think, and I also think that fits Stannis' character, that he would technically do the thing, technically take Winterfell, but the real triumph of defeating the Boltons doesn't actually belong to him, and that leads into something we talked about before, that ultimately the North is probably going to side with Jon over Stannis, and maybe if Jon is responsible for the actual downfall of the Boltons, maybe that's part of why. In terms of Theon's role in this, it's, as we were saying, Bran and Bloodraven seem to be part of this plot. Bran knows a lot about Winterfell, so maybe Bran helps Stannis out through Theon, and maybe they help him temporarily take the castle. I could see that being the end point of the plot.
Yeah, you can go back and listen to episode 10, where we actually talked about Bran's role in potentially taking Winterfell for Stannis, which is Bran's second chapter when he falls from the tower, and we have Bran talking about the tunnels that are running through Winterfell, which might be a causeway by which Stannis and his people could get into the castle itself.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Mm-hmm. And I think that about wraps up for this analysis on A Clash of Kings Brand 6. As always, thank you so much for everyone for listening. Thank you always to everyone who is watching us as well. And before I usually go into my normal spiel about please rate and review us and have a podcast, all this stuff, we want to say thank you to Stanford for joining us this evening. And we wanted to ask you, sir, where we can find your work and your social media footprint, and so to speak.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really have a Twitter. It's just my first name and last name at Twitter. So at Stanford Frasier. I've only done one Reddit analysis, and I think it was well argued, but I actually probably don't even believe the argument I made at this point. So
I got so many arguments. I'm like, that was smart. It was bullshit, but it was smart. I know what you mean.
Exactly. But follow me on Twitter for Ice and Fire takes, as well as movie takes and bad basketball takes.
Excellent.
Awesome. Yes, you're an excellent follow on Twitter, and I really enjoy our interactions there as well. If you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcasts.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotAcastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at NotAcastASOIAF, or shoot us an email over at NotAcastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at PoorQuentin on Twitter, or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpolitics.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon. Red Relu himself, who has renounced his allegiance to the Squishers. Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle. Septon Marybald, the Shoeless Sage. Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood. Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets. Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys and Lady of Jameson. Lady Britt, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal. Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood. Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill. Sir Way of Course. Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore. Lord Mark Connington, heir to Griffin's Roost. Lord Sam Kay, Sir Michael Mertens. Wisdom Benjacut, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Boole and de Morgan. Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping. Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies. Septon, Merriful Head of Hair. Lady Silverwing, Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State. Kaboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks in Castle Crimson Light. Sir Keith of House Corbray, wielder of Lady Forlorn. Lord Andrew, Warden of the Dubai Sands. Ryan Noy, Forger of the Mighty Hammer and Keeper of the King's Anvil. Lady Young of the Ghostwoods. Lady Mira Reed, wielder of Dark Sister, Slayer of Tinfoil. And our newest High Lady and High Lord, Lady of Rainy Afternoons, and Sir Will of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Commune. So thank you so much, as always, to our High Lords and Ladies, and a special welcome to Lady of Rainy Afternoons and Sir Will.
Yeah, thank you, folks, very much. I figured that you would like the Will guy the best with his.
Absolutely. As an Oberlin graduate, I know all about the anarcho-syndicalist communes.
He's yours. He's all yours. I'll take Lady of the Rainy Afternoons.
I'll take him.
So we'll be off next week. So join us in 2 weeks' time for A Clash of Kings RA9, in which she helps Bruce Bolton take Harrenhal. Yay! 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 And Jack and Hagar takes off, but not before changing his face. And we'll be joined for this episode by another new guest, Wolfman Zach, who I believe is bringing his bong, if I'm not mistaken.
Good. Exactly. We're going to have communes and weed, everything Jeff loved.
Yay!
We're so pleased to have on Wolfman Zach, our very own Hand of the King. He's one of our favorite people. I've been online friends with him so long, since I started doing online stuff with ASWAF. And we've been looking forever to have a good chapter to have him on. So in a couple weeks' time, we'll do Arya 9 with him.
Cannot wait. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to those of you who have watched us, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks' time.
All right, so we can hit the stop button on Audacity there. We can stop recording. Beautiful. And we usually stick around to do some Q&A stuff after episodes with the folks online. So if you got time, Stanford, feel free to stick around for that.
It's the pandemic. I got nothing but time.
I know the feeling, sir. I know the feeling. And thank you for everyone who's watching, as always.
Yeah, apparently there was a riveting comment section about who are like Super Mario Brother characters or Nintendo characters, these different characters in the Stark Scars. I don't know. I don't play stupid fucking video games. Not anymore, anyways. I don't have any time. Okay. So we'll start with an easy question. What is your favorite Supreme Court case? Marbury versus Madison.
I was about to say, like, let's go with the OG. I think this is not like favorite, obviously, because the result is horrible. But in terms of exposing the failure of the court to be a neutral arbiter and protect people's rights, Korematsu versus the United States, that allowed for the Japanese internment camps. That's the one I was reading about in college where I went, you know what, fuck the legal system. So I don't know favorite, but the one we're reading it had the most impact on me.
As a public defender, I have to say Gideon versus Brainwright is why I have a job.
Oh, okay.
But you know, guaranteed.
Explain this one to me because I'm dumb.
Okay, so basically, it was about a man. It was 1963. He was believe he was in Florida, and basically he couldn't afford a lawyer, so he was found guilty basically without a lawyer, and he basically writes a letter to the court, like no, not official lawyers, not a motion. He just basically writes a letter to the Supreme Court saying like, hey, this isn't right. So the Supreme Court's like, you know what? Someone should argue this. I might be messing. I'm paraphrasing the history. This isn't 100% accurate. But the court basically appoints counsel, appoints people to argue both sides, and then the court argues. You know what? You have a right to a trial, but you also have a right to you have the right to have competent counsel in trial. So the state can't convict you, right? Can't cage you, right? Can't take away your liberty without at least having you competent counsel, and basically forces a lot of states to have public defender systems. Because basically before the 1960s, some states have public defender systems, some states don't. Maybe some states have it for felonies, but not misdemeanors. But Gideon versus Wainwright really makes public defenders more of a national phenomenon.
That's great.
Yeah.
I gotta have you. You got to be a guest on the what's the legal podcast? I always fuck the name up.
The Learn
Yeah, you got to have him on. So we got a constitutional lawyer, public defender, and a corporate lawyer, all in like the same.
They all walk into a bar.
They all walk. Right, it's the start of a joke. It's great. Cannot wait.
I'd love to. Every time I listen to their pod, I'm like, man, these people this is just really in debt. These guys are better lawyers than me. So I'd love to chat with them.
They're very smart. Bless them.
Micah asks, question for Stanford because I must ask, your top 5 is Song of Ice and Fire characters.
Well, I mentioned him in the pre-show, but I don't know if he's not number 1, but I love Raymar Royce. He has a very smart moment, but I just love him as a character because it's such a quick flip. Like, this guy's terrible.
You got to tell the people about your so most people are not going to hear the pre-episode because it only goes out to our high lords and ladies and their small council patrons. But you got to tell everyone. This is something that you got to write about. Okay. But I think you should also tell everyone the brief synopsis about your Theon Waymore Royce theory.
So if you watch the show, which you should, it's a decent show, right? But in season 8, in the long night, Theon basically has a moment where he's where he's protecting Bran. Most of his men are dead, and it's him and the Night King. And Bran's like, Theon, you're a good man. And Theon basically charges the Night King. And I remember at the time I live tweeted that this is basically his Raymar Royce moment, right? This is basically his dance with me moment because he basically has no chance and no choice against the Night King, right? But he promised to defend Theon, and in this moment, he promised to defend Bran. So you have this character who, we just talked about this past chapter. He does these terrible things, right? That you kind of hate him. And then you actually feel sorry for him, but he has this moment of redemption in his last moments, right, where he does something truly courageous.
I love it.
That's great. And when you were saying, I was thinking like, okay, and where is Will watching that from? From a tree, just like how Bran watches everything. So yeah, that's a great comparison.
And it also works too because Theon's such a gigantic piece of shit for most of his arc, and then like he has something of a redemption arc in A Dance with Dragons and The Windswinder, we hope as well. Much as Waymore Royce is a kind of a gigantic piece of shit in the prologue to his fellow Night's Watchman. But at the very end of his story, he has a final moment of redemption where he goes out swinging for Robert, as he says, as he runs forward, which is just awesome. I love that. It's so good. Oh, sorry. So you only did one.
That was only one. Cool. Then, I think after that, it's pretty basic. It's Jon, Robb Stark. It was Dany. I'm still very conflicted about how the show ends. That's the question. Ever since the show ended, I always wondered. I always thought, all right, Dany's going to maybe accidentally destroy King's Landing, but find some redemption in the Long Night. And actually, ever since the show ended, I'm thinking, what if it's the reverse? And it just seems so nihilistic. It broke my heart. So she's still in my favorite characters, but it still breaks my heart.
I get you. I'm glad you said Robb because it seems silly to say Robb is underrated because he's like the young wolf and everyone knows him. But I feel like there's not as much direct love for him because he's not a POV. But I always feel deeply for Robb.
Yeah, I feel for him too. All right, so you got one more.
And then I have to think about it. Probably, I don't know, maybe Arya.
Arya.
All right,
Yeah.
everyone
Plus
loves
the
her.
Starks, right on.
Yeah,
Love
let's just mention the Starks.
Yeah. We'll definitely have you on for a future Stark-centric heavy episode for sure.
Yes, please.
Untitled Chapter asks, do you wish we could have gotten a Victorian point of view in A Clash of Kings, or is Theon enough clueless Ironborn for one book?
I love Victorian's chapters, but they're very specific to what he's doing. I don't want to just like hang out in Victorian's head while he does whatever. And George, like I had forgotten Victorian was introduced in Clash, as I think I said in an earlier episode, until this reread. In my mind, I had like said, oh, he shows up in Feast. Because he doesn't do anything. He doesn't like say, he doesn't have any dialogue in Clash. So I don't think George had a sense of who Victorian was as a character yet. So I don't think we need him around until George. And I mean, the fun of Victorian is being in his head and Victorian thinking things and you going, wait, no, idiot, that's not what's happening. And I don't think there's really many opportunities for that in Clash.
Yeah, I think Victorian comes off rather well because he actually takes Moat Caelan. I mean, so he has that moment of triumph, I guess. I mean, he doesn't hold it for long. I mean, but he takes it. He definitely that man takes Moat Caelan. You can't take that away from him. So I think it's better that we have Theon as the point of view in A Clash of Kings. Now, I will say I kind of do wish we had an Asha point of view chapter in A Clash of Kings because it seems to me that she is coming into the narrative fully fleshed out in George's mind, and George only builds on a very solid foundation that he establishes in Theon's chapters in A Clash of Kings, because she is just brimming with personality, whereas Victorian is just kind of like the guy who's in charge of the fleet, who George then elevates in terms of his perspective on how this guy's going to go down. So yeah, I think that's Asha would have been interesting, but I'm not sure that she contributes enough to the overall narrative to warrant her inclusion as a point of view character. Come A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons and The Winds of Winter, she definitely does. There's a really good question here I'm trying to find. SKNC asks, what's the narrative purpose of Barristan's past infatuation with Ashara Dane? I feel we didn't learn anything about Ashara or the tourney at Harrenhal we didn't already know.
Well, sadly, I'm not Chloe. So I can't
call her in.
I just can't answer this question properly. I think in part it's because I mean it goes hand in hand with Barristan's thoughts about Dany and Quentyn. So I think it's in part just to establish Barristan as like this old fuddy-duddy who, while well-intentioned, doesn't really have a grasp on the finer details and subtleties and motivations of the people around him. So, I think that's why that's there in terms of Barristan's personal arc. I do think it's because I think something we take for granted as people who are really into the series is like the existence of minor characters like Ashara Dane and the backstory of the Tourney of Harrenhal. But if you're just reading these books for fun, you need a reminder of like all that backstory and all these people. It's just to keep like the R plus L equals J stuff going in your brain. So I think that would have been just George also going, oh right, I haven't brought up the Tourney at Harrenhal in a while. Better do that.
Yeah, and I don't know if I fully buy into Jeff's theory that Barristan is going to, be a double cross Dany in the Winds of Winter in later books. But I think if he does, his past infatuation with Ashara is like another regret he has in life with other regrets, where he finally decides, like, I'm not going to regret this decision. I'm going to do the decision I actively want to do. So maybe it lays the groundwork for that theory. That probably won't happen, but who knows?
I think Ashara Dane is I will be fascinated to see her. I hope we do see her in the form of another character in the Winds of Winter, perhaps in A Dream of Spring. That would be very, very cool. Even if it's just simply hinted at, and she kind of maintains her facade, so to speak.
Just a flash of purple eyes. Yeah, that's
right. That would just be the perfect way that George could write her in there. So, I think Barristan is what George does with Barristan's chapters in A Dance with Dragons is very specifically and he does this a lot in A Dance with Dragons specifically, gives us the perspective of the losing side for Robert's Rebellion in the form of John Kyneton and Barristan Selmy, and also kind of gives us another perspective on the on events like the Tourney at Harrenhal and things like that. And I think too, you're right that Barristan's a fuddy-duddy and that he's very weird when it comes to Ashara Dane. I mean, he's in his 40s when he encounters her, 50s maybe, 40s, right, at the Tourney of Harrenhal.
Again, something Chloe pointed out that I never really put together until she did. I was like, oh right, Barristan's old in the present, so he wasn't young,
right?
Like 17 years ago, actually. Yeah, he was already kind of projecting.
And Ashara was like 17, 18 years old, like similar age to Ned Stark. So there's some things that we kind of should tilt our head a little bit about in terms of Barristan's conduct with the Chardane and his thoughts about her and this great unrequited love that he has for her that
For sure.
should definitely give us a bit of a
Not that he's like, an outright total creep. I just think, like Eris Oakheart, he's just kind of stunted because of the white cloak. And so, like, sexually speaking, he's kind of a 17-year-old.
Yep.
So I think he's got kind of that kind of moony mindset, projection, the way that a lot of people of that age do.
Absolutely. Caitlin asks, do you think that Beth is still alive? That is Beth Cassell. And the other people living in Winterfell, which I believe, besides Beth, is Old Nan is the only other named character. Am I wrong about that? I could be wrong about that. After being kept for so long in the Dreadfort, and what will be their fate?
Beth and Old Nan, right? I think they're the... can't imagine it's good. It's the Dreadfort and they're women, unfortunately. I don't know. Part of me hopes like George just kind of doesn't address this. I mean, not that it would necessarily be bad. I just feel like this, we already know how bad Ramsay is. I don't know how much more that we need.
Yeah, my hope is that Jon liberates the Dreadfort in some way in the Winds of Winter, and he finds that they're still alive, and I don't know, just sends them to Bravos, which seems to be the place where everyone goes to recover from their deep emotional scarring that's at the hands of the Boltons. And especially the form of Jane. And I hope they're alive, and I hope that they're that's about all I can hope for. And I hope that they can recover in some way from the horrors that they experienced in the Dreadfort, which is what the Dreadfort, again, obviously evil, like Ramsay Bolton, Roose Bolton, lords of the Dreadfort. Maybe name your castle something else. They kind of have this kind of aura around subtle, it,
right?
Yeah, right. From Evil Castle, yes.
I know, it's like the Night Fort. Like, oh, what a splendid place. Let's go hang out at the Night Fort.
Yeah, the Night Fort, the Dreadfort. Okay, this is a interesting question. Teenage Gumshoe asks, is there a way for Dany to become the stallion who mounts the world without it being really white feminist? Her becoming the quote-unquote top Dothraki and explaining why slavery is bad is kind of weird.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Edward?
It's always that tough line, like even in the real world, right, between like appropriation and like, I don't know, savior complex.
Yeah. Right.
And in like fairness, Dany does kind of go through things, and she might even go through more things with the Dothraki where it's still a little bit of appropriation, but maybe it's also just part of, I don't know, maybe she becomes assimilated in their culture.
Right.
And I don't know, like I can't even remember her serving girls now, but they're the ones who are like braiding her hair after her great victories, right? She's not actually going out and braiding her own hair. So I guess that's a long way to not answer the question.
It's a great way of not answering it.
I think that's a good point. I think the line between, and I think this might be deliberate on George's part, the line between assimilation and conquest for Dany is always kind of blurred. And like part of me is like, Dany's just, coming into this culture and taking over and telling them to do stuff and change things around. But I'm also like, Dany, I'm always hesitant to outright describe Dany as like a colonizing influence, because it is just her. Like, it's not the East India Company. You know what I mean? It's not like she's coming in with Valyria behind her. Mm-hmm. She's a singular individual. Like people have compared her to like John Brown with dragons before. So I think, and part of this is all, this is just a part of a product of a series written in the 90s when these things were less frequently discussed germane topics in science fiction and fantasy. Personally, I think I don't really have a problem with Dany's relationship with the Dothraki in itself. I wish the Dothraki as individual characters got more attention, and I think this wouldn't be a problem if that was the case. Because then I think it would be pretty clear. It's like, hey, there's this other fleshed out culture, and Dany has a complex relationship to it. As it stands, I get why if you just take the image in isolation of her in front of the burning building from season 6 and they're all bowing to her, I get why in isolation, like the image of her as the Misa in season 3, why that looks bad. Mm-hmm. But I think the context of her overall story in the books gives a little more flavor to it.
I agree that there's more flavor to Dany. I think the issue, exactly is what you're pointing out, is that we don't actually have the perspective of any of the people that she's helped to liberate that is being fleshed out, and not just people she's liberated in terms of her children, but also the Dothraki as well. And George has said he's not going to introduce additional point of view characters into A Song of Ice and Fire. So we're going to be left with Dany, Barristan, Tyrion, and maybe a few others when she gets to Westeros that are all going to be the eyes on her. And I don't know that's necessarily the best thing. As we've talked about several times here on the Nauticast podcast and other places as well, it would have really done the story some good if Missandei had been introduced as a point of view character at some point to kind of get the perspective of former slaves who had been liberated by Daenerys in order to kind of show their perspective. So I think it is a lost opportunity, a missed opportunity. I don't mind that Barriss is a point of view character because I really enjoy his chapters.
Sure.
But I do think it's also important, though, to showcase other perspectives on Daenerys Targaryen, which gives readers the chance to actually see the perspective of people that are not just the mass of her children, the mass of the Dothraki. We have these like major mega groups that are out there that really don't get a lot of personality necessarily, and they're all very secondary minor characters all together. So
I would say I don't think Dany is like fixing the Dothraki, especially if what we see in the show is canon. Like, they don't, it's not like she turns them into, suddenly they're better, wonderful people because they're following Dany. Like they're going to sack cities. So that's a different stereotype in its own right, of course, unfortunately. But I don't think it's quite like white savior. To me, it comes off more like they're just kind of convenient plot devices for Dany to do some conquering, more than like the Giscari, I think, is more where Dany is like trying to actively mold and reshape stuff. By the time she gets back to the Dothraki, I think she's done with trying to mold people. She's in full conqueror mode,
taking them on along her little journey, so to speak.
Right, exactly.
All right, Stanford, another question for you. Micmac asks, hi, Stanford, in your legal opinion, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg as gangster as she is memed to be? Also, what is your favorite legal drama? Don't know if you've heard of it, but mine is Boston Legal.
I don't know what my favorite legal drama would be, but actually HBO has a current show on Perry Mason. They're doing like a Perry Mason reboot. It just finished its first season. And while the first couple of episodes are kind of slow, I think like the episodes 5, 6, 7, and 8 are actually like pretty good. So if you have time, I would check that out. And then my favorite legal book is a book that came out recently, The Cull of Law. And it's basically about racial segregation and how it's like basically enforced by the federal government and for like a long history, for a decent amount of history in our country. On Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I'm going to be nice and say probably Justice Sotomayor is my favorite justice currently. And I'm just going to leave it at that.
100% same.
Not the same, but that's okay. We all have different perspectives.
I'm sorry, Antonin Scalia's ghost doesn't qualify for the list.
That's okay. We've got who's Scalia's successor?
So bring up Alito if you do that.
I will say I don't like Scalia's politics, but I'm one of the bad lawyers that loves his very snipey dissents. I'm not gonna lie.
I love Scalia as a writer. I wish he just like wrote fiction. I wish that had been his career, like writing writing John Grisham books. I wish Antonin Scalia had done that and not impacted people.
Yeah, I agree. There was this great book I read when I was in college called Scalia Dissents, which was just a collection of all of his dissents up to like 2004, which is.
They're wonderfully witty. They're just pure evil is the problem. But anyway.
All right. Caitlin asks, is there a specific Dothraki character which would lend much more context to Dany's story, perhaps especially in Meereen or Karth? Recaro maybe would be a good choice, I guess. I mean,
one
he's
of the Blood Riders, sure.
Yeah,
well, you talked before about Jeff. There's that one like missed opportunity in one of Dany's Carthian chapters where she sends out.
Yeah, she sends Recaro out
to investigate stuff. Like that would have been something.
That would have been better than what we got in Karth for sure. Which is, Micah says Marceline would be a good point of view. Yes, he would be an interesting guy as well. There's a question from a guy from Argentina who said it was the first time tuning in. I'm just trying to find it real quick here.
Oh, awesome.
I apologize if you go if you guys have not gotten your questions answered, please feel free to repost them.
You can only go so far up here.
Yeah, I only go so far up, unfortunately, on the live cast. Oh, here it is. Pedro asks, greetings from Argentina. Great podcast as always. One question, how legal is in Westeros the acts of the Master of Whisperers and torture in general with the Lord Confessor and everything?
That's a good question. It seems like everyone does torture. I mean, like Stannis there's the Clayton Suggs guy, and he's mentioned as always having hung out with the torturers on Dragonstone as though torturer is a job, like an official role that you have on Dragonstone. And so you have like, Corn Halfhand kind of casually mentioning torture. So I get the sense that pretty much every major faction or power group in Westeros has someone like this on their staff. I don't know how official it is, but it seems like it's everywhere.
Yeah, interrogation in Westeros is done with torture.
And bienvenido, Pedro. I speak a little Spanish. Let's connect offline and talk some Game of Thrones in Spanish, you know?
Oh,
excellent.
Wish I could speak another language besides English, and speaking it badly, of course, too. Only I can speak my own language too.
But how legal in Westeros are the acts of Master of Whisperers? I think this strikes me as being a pre-Bloodraven and post-Bloodraven kind of situation. Like I get the feeling that obviously there were very powerful, influential Masters of Westeros before Bloodraven, but the infrastructure he built, I don't think Varys is imaginable without Bloodraven setting the stage for him first.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that might be a bit varies brittle. It depends like who's in power at the time and in what area of Westeros you're in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Someone, Micah, you're banned. Torturers wear sleeveless shirts. No, blocked, banned.
Oh
God. Let's see here. Going through all of the legal questions here, all the legal debate that's occurring in our live stream episode.
Excuse me.
Answered that one already. Brenly's Peach asks, Bran adjacent, if Euron is indeed a failed Bloodraven recruit, do you think Bloodraven knows what he's up to? And if so, what is he doing about it?
Well, that is once more something we're going to get into in great detail in part 5 of our 5-part series on the Forsaken. But yeah, I do think this is the direction that the Bloodraven Bran plot is going to go in. There's something very, very Star Wars about it, as I've talked about before, that, you got the failed pupil, you got a Darth Vader figure, and then the mentor trying to redeem himself by raising the more pure, earnest version, and then they're going to have to come into conflict. So I think what Bloodraven's doing about it is training Bran. Like, I think that's what he's trying to. He's like, oh shit, I need a new one because the first one messed up as bad as he could possibly mess up. So hope you're better. I don't, that's not revealed yet because I think George is holding back on a lot of Euron stuff. But I would not be surprised if that comes up in Winds of Winter.
Yeah, I think you mentioned on the pod, it's like a Star Wars reference. I think basically Bloodraven is doing is maybe it's Obi-Wan or it's Yoda, just waiting for Luke to arrive and hopefully training them properly to finally face Darth Vader. I don't know, it's a bad parallel, but that's what I'm thinking.
No, I mean, it's not a perfect parallel, obviously, because, Darth Vader has some humanity left in him that Euron just lacks completely. But I think it's that same sense of the mentor wanting a second shot and trying to redeem themselves by raising someone better. I think that's what's going on there.
Agreed. Lena asks, question for Stanford. If you were appointed Master of Laws in Westeros, what would you change?
Oh, man, way to put me on the spot.
You're going to be put on the spot a lot of this episode. It's great.
What you get for being smart. It's your own fault.
I should have never revealed I was a lawyer, right? I guess I would, First Night is already banned, but I'd go through the North and maybe go through other jurisdictions and maybe send some, not police officers, we're gonna abolish them, but some healthcare administrators that are taking notes just to make sure that the practice of First Night isn't actually secretly going on. Maybe add some more penalties. Who knows? I don't know if that's an actual law, but that's something I think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about First Night. You can't really enforce or it's not really enforced. It's banned, but not enforced. The ban is not enforced so much because, as Bruce Bolton points out, that the First Night is kept by the Umbers and by other houses in the North, like major houses in the North, not just the Mountain Clansmen who are out there in the woods that no one can reach, but up at the Last Hearth and other places as well. So I think enforcement of the law would definitely be good. Of course, it does bring up my thing about the First Night and how George is borrowing heavily from his, I want to say fiction because there's some evidence that it existed in some capacity historically, but it was not anywhere to the extent of how terrible and awful, not terrible and awful because it's terrible and awful, but it was not practiced as widely as some people tend to believe. And this idea of it occurring in Scotland that came up in Braveheart was not something that actually happened historically, which is, it's fine that George borrows from it, but I think too, when people are like, it's ripped from the pages of history, Song of Ice and Fire is, you have to contextualize that in the form of yes, but also more ripped from the pages of historical depictions of history like Braveheart and other things like that. Exactly.
I completely agree with that. And as Clint is saying in the chat, it's just not really clear what the Master of Laws does.
Right.
Because Renly is the master of laws at the start of the series, and we don't really see him practicing it, and then it just kind of gets set on the the shelf for the rest of the series. So potentially, it's a job that can kind of be whatever you want it to be. So that's we don't know much about the reforms still that Aegon 5 Egg put in place, but a very proactive master of laws maybe could try to follow up on some of that and maybe try to go after the lord's rights of pit and gallows.
Yep.
That's a difficult hill to climb, but that's something a really kind of devoted master of laws could take on maybe.
Oh, and I don't know if it's a law, but I maybe try to create a small folk scholarship program for the Citadel. Why not, right?
Yeah, I like that.
I have a lot of
yeah.
Just diversity, just a little diversity, little crumbs for the small folks,
I like that one. I think it's about when they're picking a new high septon, the election, the High Sparrow ends up winning, and like Chiron's. I think that's what happens when they say like they considered some small folk, and then having satisfied themselves that they considered some small folk, they're going to go ahead and pick a noble. They say something like that. So yeah, I mean the Citadel, as an institution, if you reform, that could do a lot of good in Westeros because everyone listens to their maester. So if you could get some better representation there, that could have a huge impact. That's a good one.
Stanford, I might want you for Grand Maester as opposed to Master of Laws, because of course the position is completely ambiguous anyways, but I think you would function better because you in that capacity for sure. BYA Kungan, I'm sorry, I apologize for mispronouncing your name, says, if the Red Wedding hadn't happened, what would Robb have returned to in the North? And do you think Roose would have turned on Ramsay or turned against Robb without the phrase?
No to the latter. I don't think Roose on his own is not enough to take down Robb's loyalist army. He just doesn't have the men. I think you absolutely need both the Boltons and the Freys in order to pull off the Red Wedding. If let's say like when Roose is marching north to the Twins, a rock falls on his head and he dies and Walder Frey gets cold feet and the Red Wedding doesn't happen. I mean, Robb's plan about taking Moat Cailin seemed pretty sound to me. What did you think about that, Jeff? His plan to kind of outflank Victarion. Do you think that would work?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of easy to outflank Victarion,
right?
just run loops around on Victarion. I think the plan was good. I think it. One of the things is just, and we'll get to this when we get to A Storm of Swords, but
sure.
What was the plan for the Riverlands? Because Robb had declared himself to be like the king of the rivers and the North as well. All of these things at the same time. So, he leaves Brynden Tully as warden of. He invents the new position of Brynden Tully as being the warden of the rivers or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact title, or the warden of the Southern Marshes or something.
Right, that's the one.
Yeah. How does the Riverlands? How do they stay loyal to the Starks? Do they start to turn to the Lannisters? I think that's kind of the point that we would have. We would have the discussion about. Now, I think the Boltons. Again, we were talking about this last week. We were talking about how Roose was willing to jump to either side as far as the dinner that he had with Jaime Lannister at Harrenhal. So he's willing to go back to the Stark cause if Jaime hadn't played ball with the Boltons. So that's the I think if the Boltons are going north, I'm just imagining a scenario where Roose Bolton can somehow get away with the fact that the Boltons have just sacked Winterfell and everyone finding out about this, because as Stannis marches to Winterfell, he finds all of the people who are survivors of the Bolton betrayal at Winterfell itself. And they all try to just lay that all on his son, Ramsay, and probably, but at the same time, it just doesn't, a lot of it doesn't make sense. I don't know.
That's a good point. Roose kind of has to do something lest what happened in the North get exposed, even if, he can hopefully try to disavow Ramsay as much as he possibly can. But, Ramsay ran off with a bunch of Dreadfort, man. That doesn't look good. So, I think Roose would have to have some kind of backup plan.
I don't know. I mean, this, again, for a lot of these alternate universe questions, I mean, they're interesting, but we wouldn't have the story we have if the Robb Stark had gotten north. Robb Stark was doomed from the very beginning, as George has said, because the first decision that George made in writing A Song of Ice and Fire was that he knew that Ned Stark was going to die. The second decision he made is that Catelyn and Robb would then also die as well. So again, this is something that's it's something we're not going to. I don't think there's a really satisfying answer beyond that. It would not be the story that we know. I mean, we can come with all sorts of different ideas, but I think it's just impossible to kind of imagine that kind of fleshing itself out. Renzo asked, do you guys think the current political climate in the USA will influence George's writing in The Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring?
Oh, okay. My big tinfoil theory right now is the reason why we don't have The Winds of Winter is because George is adding a grayscale epidemic pandemic right now. There's no way you could see what's happening in the world, in the United States, and just not write. Yeah, just not write a chapter of like, I don't know, Ariane Martell being super bored in a tower because she's like can't leave because she's like quarantined or something like that.
It's just the princess in the tower again. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, I like that. That's really good. I'm sure whatever grayscale stuff he already had in there, I'm sure has a different feel to him now. But it's like obviously it's never going to be 1-to-1, but especially as he's doing a lot of writing and rewriting of it now, like stuck away in his quarantine isolation in the cabin. There's no way it can't influence him. Yep. I just think it's hard to say how. But yeah, of course it is.
I think, I get a very strong vibe from reading the final chapters. Well, most of Jon's chapters in A Dance of Dragons, but especially the final couple chapters where Jon is bringing the wildlings south of the wall, and not see George reacting to this nativist anti-immigrant sentiment, which was really starting to creep up in the wake of the 2010 election, especially the midterm elections that occurred there, and of course the anti-immigrant sentiment, which has been unfortunately a feature, not a bug, of the current Republican Party. The aspect that I think is going to be coming up too is I think George might play with that come more The Winds of Winter. What happens now the wildlings are in the north? Now they've been brought south of the wall. Now that Tormund is here. I think that's something that we're going to be seeing a lot of given the wake of the 2016 election and all of the horrific immigration decisions that the Trump administration has made, and how I could see most northern lords being like, we need to kick these people back up north of the wall because they don't belong here. They're taking our lands, they're taking our food. We don't have much food, so we need to like offload them on to someone else, send them back north of the wall where they belong. They can go back voluntarily. Was the voluntary deportation? I think we can see like
exactly.
We can see like Wyman Manderley proposing that, right? Voluntarily deport yourselves back north of the wall.
We'll make it so unpleasant for you that that you have to go. Yeah, and I mean, and I also think it's difficult to separate George's influence from the current political climate from older political climates, because of course, those things lead into each other. Like Quentin's storyline in The Dance with Dragons, I think there's definitely Iraq echoes in there, like really strong war in Iraq echoes. But there's also, I think, really strong Vietnam echoes, and I think those could have been written into Quentin's story before we invaded Iraq. And the wheel of time rolls around, and definitely part of what led America to go to war in Vietnam. There were definitely similar motivations a generation later for us going to war in Iraq. So those things combine. So I think what influences George from his own youth and from previous eras, I think will intertwine with what influences him from the current moment.
Agreed. Joe, the Magician, says, do you think Jon will ever learn more about his parents as people, or will his knowledge of them just that they exist and how it impacts his royal claims? Well, you're a Jon fan, Stanford. You can answer this one about whether Jon will find out more about his parentage and whether it'll impact him more than just the knowledge of his royalty, so to speak.
Yeah, let me think. I don't want to say I'm too heavily influenced by the TV show, but I was TV show first, then went to the books. And I always thought there'd be something in the crypts, right? But nothing was found on the show. And I don't know if that was like too niche for the show, but maybe like Jon would find out that there was some love between like his actual biological parents, and he finds that out by something that's in the crypts, like what's actually left behind for him. But I don't know if any more knowledge deeper than that.
I agree. I mean, I think part of me thinks like, well, it can't just be the claims. Like that's a little cold. Like, George loves his romanticism and his deep character emotions. But I also think part of the sorrow of Jon's POV is he doesn't get to just sit and talk to Rhaegar and Lyanna, and he doesn't get the full explanation of who they were and what they were trying to do and what they were like. So I think he'll get glimpses and hints, little visions, little scraps, stuff they leave behind. But I don't think he or we are ever going to get a complete canonical, every I is dotted, every T is crossed vision of Rhaegar and Lyanna's story. I think we're always just going to get fragments of it.
Yeah. I think the idea of Rhaegar and Lyanna is supposed to fill Jon with this, not necessarily, I mean, it will give him like a royal pedigree, so to speak, but I think it's also supposed to just make him feel really sad and pissed off that he was lied to throughout his entire life.
Sure.
It's supposed to be this thing that is not going to be like, John, you are the chosen one. In fact, what I think what George is doing with John being the chosen one is being like, what does it actually mean to someone to actually find out that he is the chosen one after a long time? Like you point out really well in the past, Emmett, about how George has written Catelyn's story to be about what was King Arthur's mother like, that sort of like idea of taking the secondary look at what different characters and what different experiences would bring to the table. And I think that's the same thing that George would do with Rhaegar and Lyanna, and what then their influence on John. It'll make him be like, dude, I've been lied to my entire life. Like, everyone told me I was a bastard. I took so much shit for being a bastard of Winterfell, from Catelyn, from others as well. When all this time, you guys knew, everyone knew. It won't be everyone, but I mean, the people that will be revealing it to him will know that John is actually the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. So I think it's going to have a major emotional impact on John, more than an impact on him about his royal lineage, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think John ultimately, I think we saw a version of this in season 8, is just doesn't want that life, and is just kind of exhausted by all the politicking it would take to have that life. So I think he will largely reject what that kind of lineage and heritage laid upon him, and I think he will learn just enough to make that decision, I guess, is what I think about it.
And I think if it actually ends up being at the end that John actually does kill Dany, I think the reveal of his parentage would be like, oh, okay, Ned took the ultimate hit on his honor in order to protect him, right? So maybe that's like one final lesson that Ned will teach.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely,
great point. Another Stanford question. At Stanford, what do you think of the idea of packing the Supreme Court?
This is great. I think my most typical, not leftist, typical lib take is that I don't want to pack the Supreme Court. Sure. I know. I'm just I don't know. If we pack it, other people will pack it. I can't lie.
No, I get that. I mean, half of me agrees. Half of me goes the Republicans are going to do whatever they want, whenever they want. They've made that pretty clear. And, but then part of me thinks well, isn't that just a race to the bottom? But then should we unilaterally disarm? And I think this is often the conflict people on the left feel about institutional questions. Yeah. Should we really cling to these institutions? Are they helping us out? Should we break away from them? What are the consequences? It's very hard.
Yeah, I did read an article that we expanded the amount of federal judges under Jimmy Carter, and that was the last time we did that. And Jimmy Carter, was before I was born. So maybe we can just expand the amount of federal judges again.
Sure,
that's a good compromise. I'll take that.
Or just filling positions that are there. I mean, that was one of the disappointments with Obama, was how few judges he was appointing. So just ramping up that rate would be good.
Mm-hmm. Another Stanford question. Micah asks, for Stanford, Stan's thoughts: yay, meh, or nay?
I was trying to win the throne to save the kingdom, when I should have been trying to save the kingdom to win the throne.Stannis is great. Those are my Stannis thoughts. We'll see how great he is when I actually read him burn his own daughter, right? But
sure. No, that line is great. I completely agree. Yeah. That's going to be some great stuff. I know, Frank has yet to forgive me for trashing Stannis so hard during a Clash of Kings. This is the book where he sucks. And that's why it makes it so special in A Storm of Swords when he shows up at the wall and says some great things. You're supposed to go, oh, he's not totally an asshole. If you already were on board, then that wouldn't be a thing. But we'll get to that in A Storm of Swords.
Mm-hmm. Alan asks, what do you think will be the end of Theon in the books? Benioff and Weiss's comments strongly suggest that his ending in the TV series was their invention. Pretty much, from what we could tell, the end states of characters, George has said that the end states of major characters will mirror that of between the books and the show. In terms of whether they, I interpret that to mean that it will be basically whether they live or whether they die. And I think that the specific details will be changed between the two. I'll be honest. I mean, as much as the Long Night episode was not one of my favorite Game of Thrones episodes of all time, I found certain moments of it just utterly compelling. And I think the ones we've been talking about has been the death of Theon Greyjoy in defense of Bran Stark, the no chance, no choice moment that he had. So I think if George goes that route, it would be immensely satisfying and fulfilling. I'd be curious who would be the point of view character, whether it be Bran or Theon. Again, the question we asked in this chapter, whether Theon or Bran should have been the point of view for the fall of Winterfell. But yeah, I think it would be great if it was mirrored in the books and the show. What do you, Jonathan, think?
I think this is one of the things where I don't know if it's going to mirror the show. And I think Emmett during the podcast even said like he thought Theon was going to be dead at the end of Clash of Kings, and then he was brought back for Dance of Dragons. And in a way, he's like, oh, we don't need him to be brought back, but then we get some of the best chapters just following his arc throughout the story.
That's very true.
I think George could go anywhere with Theon, which is probably what makes him one of the, I don't know, less theorized people for like the next couple of books, because you really don't know where they're going to go or where his journey is going to go.
As much as I love his story kind of coming full circle to Bran and Winterfell, the timing is just so different with regards to what's going on in the Iron Islands. So I could potentially see a situation in which he goes back as Theon latecomer to follow the latecomer precedent and does it just enough to crack open the door for Euron's downfall and then returns to Winterfell. I could to complete his story. I could potentially see that, but that could also just be purely a show and invention, and he heads off to the Iron Islands and his story concludes there. I could see it.
We could see it all going different ways. SKNC asks, how long will the second long night last in the books?
More than a night. I mean, I think, more than the equivalent of a single episode of television, but I don't think it's going to like take up the whole of A Dream of Spring or anything like that. I would say a chunk, a good solid chunk of that last book.
I mean, George could always integrate a time skip in, so it's
true.
You can have the long night being longer than it actually is portrayed on page, where it's like day-to-day operations of what's happening. I mean, as George talked about, he originally planned for one Bran chapter to occur, and then the next month there'd be an Arya chapter, and then we would go, by the time like the story would happen, the characters would all be aged up to the place that he wanted them to be. And then so I could see that George actually doing that. Maybe, probably not. But I think that's a possibility. We could see a time skip that George could integrate. But I think, longer than a singular episode of TV, probably through the space of 2/3 of A Dream of Spring, right? Maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could definitely see that structure working out fine. Like, it's not going to be totally like Lord of the Rings, obviously, but, Sauron goes down 2/3-ish of the way through Return of the King. So could be similar.
True that. We got to have a scouring of the Shire there afterwards for scouring of Westeros, so to speak.
Yes,
You'd be surprised to know that everyone's fighting about Stannis in the live. Shockingly, I know.
All of you are wasting your time. Stop.
SKNC asks, will Bran gain so much knowledge from the werewoods that him being a 10-year-old won't be a hindrance to him being king of Westeros?
I think it won't. Not a hindrance in terms of his ability to do it. I just think, as George himself has kind of acknowledged, it is still just kind of silly because he's just a kid. I think that is just a hurdle we're all just going to have to swallow and get past.
Yeah, I think the one great part about the books being so delayed is we can just pretend people are so much older than they are.
True.
Yes, that does help.
I mean, Isaac Hempstead Wright was a fully fledged adult by the time Game of Thrones finished, right? If I'm not mistaken.
And he looked the part. He looked like, when I picture an older, wiser Bran, he looks like that, but he's not going to be that age in the books.
He does. Now, the one thing I will say is that George has talked about that magic is not a shortcut for us, for characters to kind of like punch through like a thorny plot issue.
Sure. He's
talked about it being something that should be a challenge and should be something that readers and that the characters who are involved in magic should have. It should provide conflict for the characters and not as a shortcut. So I think the werewood knowledge is not going to be like, oh, suddenly Bran has been leveled up to being the king of Westeros. He has all the knowledge of all the world now. It's supposed to be this moment where, of course, ends with hold the door for Hodor, and that being this kind of like moment of extreme trauma for Bran, I think. Obviously, obvious trauma for Hodor too. And we'll kind of like pull him away, I think, ultimately from that perspective. So I think that's what George is going for Bran being in the werewoods, but something we'll see a little bit more played out come the Winds of Winter, I guess.
Something I liked they said in the show is that it wasn't even like, I mean, it's part that Bran has power, but it's also just a repository of knowledge and wisdom and lore that he's just kind of like, he's the keeper of that flame, and he just kind of keeps that alive. And I like that aspect to it.
Mm-hmm. Teenage Gumshoe asks, could the North end up like Dorne by having semi-independence? They can keep the title of king and queen like Dorne keeps prince. I just think the story is going towards a independent North, right? I think that the King of the North, this whole idea of like Torrhen's crown is missing. So we, at some point level, we have to get to the point where we're back to the actual crown of Winter being reforged, so to speak, or not just reforged, but also perhaps being found or something like that. I just think that there's so much more going on with this idea that the North is going to be independent ultimately at the end of the series and not be a part of the Seven Kingdoms.
Yes, actually, my only Reddit post analysis was actually at the end of season 8, which was actually, I think, Northern independence, while the North wanted, is maybe actually a bad idea for the North for their material well-being and interest. And I was talking about they got to make their own currency. What's the exchange rate? Will they still get maesters from the Citadel? There's like a lot of unanswered questions about what happens when you have an independent North.
True.
But I think if you think seasons and like the long winters are more magical connected, then like there's not that many issues to having an independent North. But that's basically my answer to the question.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, you got Stark supremacy, you got a Stark in King's Landing and a Stark in Winterfell. So I mean, it's basically they're going to be
Stark on the high seas.
That's right, Stark on the high seas. You got Starks everywhere. Starks for days. Another Stanford question. Frank B, hi, get back to studying, says, Stanford, favorite video game, movie, book, and or TV show you consume pre-quarantine and during quarantine?
Okay, my wife, Michelle Hall, wants me to shout her out, so I'll shout her out. She's my favorite person. Wasn't asked.
Hi, Michelle.
Yay.
I gotta do that. All right. Favorite video game. I'm pretty boring, so probably Pokemon Black and White 2, when I first played that one. That was very enjoyable. I don't know. And then maybe Mega Man 64 is also tied for my favorite video game. And like, I don't know, one of the 90s Zelda games. I can't decide which one. I don't know. Maybe Ocarina of Time. They're all great. I can't decide. Can't go wrong with any of them. Favorite book? All right, we're going to go outside of Song of Fire and Ice. I think, all right, one book that really moved me when I read it in college, but I don't know if I'd like it anymore, is The Invisible Man. I think Ralph Ellison. Yeah. And then my favorite book that I read from school, I think maybe it was 8th grade, was Lord of the Flies. I just love that book as well. And Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison. Okay.
Okay. Awesome.
TV show that I consumed pre-quarantine. Was I supposed to give a favorite thing pre-quarantine and during quarantine? I don't know. TV show pre-quarantine, I'm going to Leftovers. One show I watched during quarantine is Justified.
You watched Justified?
Hell yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's propaganda, but I love it.
It's
like,
great.
Justified is great. Oh my
God, it is.
It's great. And Hulu has it in Spanish. So if you want to practice Spanish and rewatch Justified,
hey, there you
watch
go.
Justified in Espanol.
Love it.
Oh, my wife also has been playing Animal Crossing. She bought me a Nintendo Switch for Christmas, and then since quarantine happened, I bought her Animal Crossing, and now I don't have a Switch because she plays it every
Funny
day.
how that goes.
Joe Magician asks, who dies first of these three characters? Arianne, Doran, or Ariohota? Doran Martell, Ariohota, Arianne Martell. Ario has to be the eyes on watching Doran die.
Sure, right.
Then Ario has to die. Then Arianne Martell will die in the consuming fire of King's Landing when Daenerys burns it to the ground. Solved it.
I like that. Part of me thinks like Duran. Part of me wants Duran to be the last one to go, just because he's he's just watching and he's planning and he's got to have like a big revelation when he realizes it's all going wrong. But then he'd already have that with Quentin. So I think that order works well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with the order.
Good. Look, everybody's agreed with me for once. For one question. Take a few more here.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Mick Bang asks, do you think it was the show's intention that all the Starks that Bobby B touched on his arrival at Winterfell are the ones who would not survive the story?
Is that right?
I'm trying to think. Is that so? Ned, right?
Ned, he hugs Catelyn. I think he grabs Rob's shoulder. Maybe is that what happens?
It says it's all Robert's fault. Like it's like the curse
Robert
of like Robert
Cursed
touches. Yeah, everything Robert touches turns to death. Yeah, that's weird.
I don't think he touched Rickon though.
That's true.
I doubt that's intentional, but that's fun to contemplate.
I definitely think it's one of those coincidences and like things that go viral.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's a BuzzFeed article ready to be written about this right now. Like every single Stark that Rob, like oh my god, like share this on Twitter and with all your friends on Facebook. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's an interesting connection. Maybe. Caitlin asks, "What do you think of Dario equals Euron?"
Okay.
Yeah, but give us your true feelings.
So this is one of those things where it's like people have taken a thing that's supposed to be a metaphorical connection and made it painfully literal. Like Dario is for me is set up for Euron. He's the this is the kind of man that Dany would find attractive. What if she's into Euron? Wouldn't that be dangerous? I don't think she's actually going to be, but it sets it up to make it plausible. It's not that they're literally the same person. It's like saying that Mance is literally Rhaegar. No, Mance is set up for Jon dealing with his father figure of Rhaegar. They're not identical. Like, imagine the execution of that. Like, Dario's just going to, come back out, his hair is undyed, and he goes, aha, I was Euron Greyjoy the whole time. And Dany's going to go, okay. Like, no, I don't think, no, Dario is not literally Euron. That doesn't make sense.
You don't think Dario's going to... You don't think Dario's going to say, hey, I invented astral projection in this world? I've been everywhere? That's not going to happen.
As alas, alack, I don't think so. Again, there's clearly a connection. Like the same chapter where Dany's fucking Dario, that's when she has the dream about Euron. So there's clearly connections here. I don't think it's just a literal one-to-one connection like that.
Right. So, yeah, exactly. I think you put it up really well. Yeah, it's supposed to be set up for Daenerys and for the relationship that she might have with Euron Greyjoy at some level. So I think that's yeah. I think you said it well. Oh, I also asked the chat for for more dumb theories that we can have you react to. So everybody seemed to really enjoy you rolling your eyes and leaning back and looking at the sky.
Just come on. Dario is the Euron in the same way that Quentin is the Jon. This is set up for the men, that Dany will have to deal with later in Westeros. But yeah, no, not the same thing.
I'm not gonna.
It's like saying a Victorian must be Stannis because they have things in common. No.
It's so good. Let's see here. What would the three of you name your direwolves, dragon, and flagships? By BYA Kugan 0889, which apparently is some sort of cartoon character. I don't know. I don't watch that shit.
What do you think about that, Stanford? What would you name a direwolf? You like the Starks?
Yeah. So dragon, I'd go lame. I'd go like Fireball. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's a petty name. Yeah.
No, can't go wrong.
And then for direwolves, it's tough because I think all the great names have already been taken. But maybe like Shadow, if it's a
Oh yeah, that's solid. Can't go wrong with that.
And then flagships. I have never thought of that, but I don't know. Maybe something. I got to think of something ironic. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know. If we have like iron, maybe like copper, the Copperborn or something. I don't know. This is like weird play on words.
I'm so bad at like naming stuff. I have no creativity whatsoever.
You named Tina named the kids, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I mean I did. Yeah, I did the Roman names to my children. Yeah, she was like, I'm like, let's do this one. Let's do this Roman name. No, we're not going to name him Pertullius. Shit like that. So, no, yeah.
Tough. I mean, again, like Stanford, just a lot of the good ones are taken because I would love to name a ship the Silence. Alas, Euron got to it first. Yeah, I don't really know. It's nothing's really coming to mind on this one. I'll consider it for a minute, but
I don't know either. Yeah, it's hard.
So Clint says in the chat, Jeff would name his direwolf the Cautioner's Dog. That's about right.
Yes, the Cautioner's Dog. Oh my God, Bears asked, which of the direwolves is the floofiest?
I mean, Shaggy Dog has it right in the name. He's very shaggy.
Lady, right? Come on.
Well, true. Lady. Well, floof. I mean, are we talking floofiest or silkiest? There's just so many gradations.
Softest. It's obviously softest.
Okay,
yeah.
Then that's lady. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely lady.
I'm going curveball. I'm going Ghost. I feel like he gets the most on page pets. So
that's true. Wasn't that the big complaint about season 8? One of the big complaints was it wasn't petted enough. Yeah.
Enough proof. Grey Wind probably has like fur like steel wool. He's the intense. He's the fighter.
Yeah. The lady definitely wins. Maybe we'll take two more and then we'll call it a night, gentlemen, if you're good with that.
Sounds
Stanford,
fun to
again,
me.
thank you so much for sticking around for so long with everyone. All the legal questions we're getting here.
Right.
Great. Alan asked, do you think Maegor died and was resurrected after the trial by combat, becoming a fire white, and that was why his children were abominations?
So there is that weirdness about potentially his mom bringing him back. And yeah, given how often that seems to come up with the Targaryens, and again with like Victarion and Makuro, I would say that's probably a good bet. What do you think?
I think I think that's the case, and I think it's something that George will do in order to come the Winds of Winter, I guess, as well. Because I mean, he's talked about that Barrett and Darian and Catelyn are fire whites. It's new terminology. Is it actually new terminology? I don't know. It's new terminology, at least by like 2017. So I think that's that's likely what will happen. What happened with Maegor? So he's writing Fire and Blood at the time and had that in mind as well. And I think it's also supposed to be what happens with Jon come the Winds of Winter. He's likely going to be some sort of fire white type person as well.
Yeah. I guess I selfishly hope not, so Jon can have some bastard children of his own, right?
True.
So we can write fan fiction about them, later on when the series are done. But actually, this reminds me of another theory that I have that I should actually write this up. That basically we're gonna get a trial of 7 in the Winds of Winter. Maegor had one. The Hedge Knight had one. Anything that happens once, okay, coincidence. But if it happens twice, has to happen 3 times.
You're waiting for a third. Yep, I get you.
So we're waiting on that.
Yeah, we'll see. We shall see. All right, let's pick a final question and call it an evening.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about George's Hugo controversy last week. Go ahead and listen back to that Q&A portion of the episode. This is the final question from last week, so go ahead and listen to that. We want to answer that one this week. Everybody wants your wife's Twitter now. They think that she's cool.
Ooh, okay. I don't know if I have permission.
she's saying it's private, so she's
that
she's telling people to
hold on to that privacy.
Yeah, for long as you possibly can. All right, last question.
Message me and I'll send it to my wife, and if she thinks your message is funny enough, she'll add you.
That's good. That's standard to have. I approve of that. Right on.
All right. Caitlin asks, what kingdoms will Aegon the Sixth take? Just King's Landing, the Stormlands, or more?
Well, I mean, Dorne, I don't think he's going to conquer it, but I think Dorne will be the Martells will offer him their allegiance, and the Dornish support will be behind him. There's a bunch of Reach Lords that are around the area that Jeff has written about well before, are likely to join up with him. So a general coalition of the South. I don't think he's going to be around long enough to gain much more support than that.
Yeah, I don't think he gets. I think when he gets to King's Landing, that's his final resting place. So, yeah, I don't think he's going to be taking the Riverlands and progressing on into the North or the Vale or anything like that. I think his story has been focused on King's Landing, as all of the Blackfire pretenders have all focused on the capital of Westeros to their detriment, have not branched out beyond that and gone for the source of power, and then have all fallen as we're trying to take the city. Aegon will take the city and then will fall after taking the city, which is just a poetic way for the Blackfire cause to end.
You finally get what you want, then it all falls apart. Yeah. The one exception I could see here, and I don't think this will necessarily happen, but it might be like a fun fan fiction thing, is the Brackens, because they have such a history with the Golden Company and the Blackfires, and Jonas Bracken is such a turncloak. So I could see a thing where he sends a message to King's Landing, "Oh, we're so glad you're here, King Aegon. I've been waiting for you this whole time. Can I be Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, please? I bent the knee first." That is kind of in character for the Bracken, so I could see that.
Well, I think he might go to one other castle, and that's the Stokeworth Castle where Bronn is.
Oh, sure, right. We got to get Bronn in on this somehow. Yeah, that's fair.
Bronn versus young Griff, that would be great. Just imagining it, great. So
the future Maester of Coin.
Future Lord of the Reach,
and Lord of the Reach, and Lord of the Highgarden. Yeah,
Lord of everything.
Oh, so bad. Kill me. No, no, don't do that. Gosh. Yeah, I mean, everyone was mad about Dany, what Dany did at the end of season 8. But me, I was like,
Bronn is the problem.
Bronn doing the Master of Coin, throw my, remote the TV at that point. Like Dany burning King's Landing, this mass atrocity seems perfectly in keeping with what I understand from the books. But Bronn is Master of Coins? No, sir. That's not what's happening. No, sir. So it is 11:34 on the Eastern Seaboard here. We really appreciate everyone sticking around and joining us tonight. We thank Stanford as well for sticking around too to 11:30 and answering everyone's questions. And we will definitely have you back for a future episode for whatever you want to come on for. We really appreciate your presence and insight and input. It's awesome. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for having me. This was a great time.
Absolutely.
All right, folks. Well, thank you again for watching. Thank you for all of your questions, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks' time. I was about to say next week. 2 weeks' time. Take care.